Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. A meeting with a snake and a dragon. You know, your hospitality leaves something to be desired. Taking a sip of the cup of tea he had managed to persuade them to make for him, he sent a smirk towards the one who had served him the tea before placing it back down against the table in front of him. Poison? This part is always one of my favorites when I manage to get into enemy camps. Everyone always likes to try and take the easy route out. Holding his hand over the cup, black mist slowly spread from his fingers before mingling with the tea and pulling forth a faint shade of purpose from the liquid. With a flick of his wrist the energy was raised to his mouth and swallowed whole, much to the annoyance of Mistogan standing nearby. I suppose it was you that did this? Jin asked, glancing over at the mage in question. Yes, that look of disappointment and anger is what I've come to expect from attempts like this. If you want to poison me, you'll need a much stronger type of poison. I'd recommend strawberries. Can't stand them. You're a godslayer, Orga stated, leaning against the edge of the opening of the Genesis with a wary look on his face. I'd recognize magic so similar to my own in a heartbeat. A poison godslayer if I was to take a guess too, going by the lack of effect Mistogan's attempts just had. And here I thought you were all brawn and no brains, Jin replied, putting on an expression of fake surprise. I have to say though that it's always a fun game to find out which one will try and poison me. You'd be surprised at which people are normally the ones to try it. When I subjugated a territory for Emperor Spriggan once and met with the leaders, it was their daughter who tried to kill me off. She must have been, what? 5? 6? It's always fascinating to see what kind of reactions humans will bring out to threats when faced with the opportunity. Jin, God Serena chided. Stop wasting time with this farce. My time is valuable and I do not appreciate it being wasted in a meeting such as this. It's hardly a stage that I enjoy. With pride like that it's no surprise you abandoned Ishgar, Kisuk commented, standing away from the two so he could observe them both without having to take his eyes off either. Not that such words mean much from me, but if this meeting is so tedious for you then perhaps you should inform us exactly why you desired it. Well, that's quite simple, Jin began to say before God Serena cut him off with a single word. Acknowledge. Almost all focus left Jin to focus on God Serena. Merely mentioning the name of the beast was enough to drop all pretenses of being civilized, gazes demanding information from the man who cared little about giving it. Jin let out a sigh at the sudden shift in tone. We were meant to ease this topic in Serena. I told you, I don't want my time to be wasted longer than it needs to be. Acknowledge is the reason we are here, so let's not pretend otherwise. Sure. Let's cut straight to the chase then, said Jin as he began to rest his hands against the table. As God Serena over there put it, our reason for coming here is simple. Initially we had to ensure your survival if things went badly. Our own little Valkyrie had some bad dreams, you see, and forced Emperor Spriggan's hand, as much as he hated to do so. Afterwards, our mission was to make contact and ask for the assistance of Ishgar in dealing with a common enemy. And you think we'll work with someone like you? Asked Gray, slumped back in his chest in an effort to try and not strain his injuries. You lot are just as likely to stab us in the back. You lot were one of the ones who started this war in the first place. You can't trust us. Jin let out a mocking laugh as he placed his hand over his heart. Does this look like the face of someone who would stab you in the back? Yes, Nozomi stated from her position, watching Jin like a hawk. You would in a heartbeat. Oh? Why so certain? You remind me of an old friend. He enjoyed pretending to join the enemy only to stab them in the back when they trusted him the most. Jin's smile grew at her words. So why are you so sure he was even on your side? A person like that, they could easily be playing everyone in the world and no one would be the wiser of what side he was on beside his own. He could very well have been preparing the knife and waiting for you to turn away. You dash. Nozomi almost took a step forward before she caught herself, her expression turning cold. Yes, exactly like him. Your words are more dangerous than anything else you do. And you know it too. Guilty. Turning away from her, Jin cast his focus to the rest of the group. Regardless of whether you can trust me or not, the question lies elsewhere. Can you afford to not have our help? Acknowledge is a terrifying creature, and is not one easily brought down. 400 years and no one has yet done it, despite the numerous attempts of thousands of dragons and countless mages from legends. None have yet to succeed in taking down such a ferocious beast. And yet you believe we can succeed where they all failed if we work together, stated Hibiki suspiciously. What makes you so certain of this when not even all the dragons that once roamed the land couldn't do so? Even if their strength was lacking, numbers should have been able to do the trick. In today's age, even the amount of dragon slayers in the world are far fewer than there once were. It's obvious, isn't it? God Serena stated arrogantly. There is a higher quality of dragon slayer in today's age. Even my fellow actors shine with greater radiance than those of the past. And you think yourself to be one of those superior mages, Hibiki concluded. I saw the use of your magic and it looked too similar to dismiss, but your arrogance here confirms it. You're a dragon slayer. The dragon slayer, God Serena corrected. Comparing other dragon slayers to me is like comparing a rock to a diamond. I reign above all others in my field, just as one would expect from a star. And yet you cannot do this alone, Ichigo spoke. While many mages had been most wary of Jin, his eyes had never left God Serena for a single moment. With all the power you possess, even with the power of the world, you can't beat Acknowledge, can you? Ichigo spoke Shinji warily. He's a Nukin. I wouldn't be surprised if he was the trump card of Alvarez, or at least one of them. He's dangerous, Kelia agreed, Wendy giving her own nod by her friend's side. The energy around him shines like a falling star. A dazzling light that destroys all it comes into contact with. And you still can't win? Asked Hibiki suspiciously. Ichigo fought Acknowledge once and was able to stay even with him. In physical speed and strength I could, Ichigo corrected. But that's not all Acknowledge is. Beyond physical ability, there is also the vast quantities of magical power it possesses, along with the ability it has to utilize so much of it with ease. I was able to stop a full-powered roar from it because I had the energy ready to use. I would not have been able to stop a second one, and even weathering through it would have harmed me. As your leader explained, Jin said as he took back control of the conversation, Acknowledge is not so easily beaten. Beyond all of what you've heard, there is also a mind honed in battle over 400 years and a hatred that runs so deep that it drives that beast to unprecedented levels. Mass numbers won't stop it because it'll wipe them out with a giant roar. One individual can't do it because Acknowledge will use whatever aspect of itself it reigns superior in to take advantage of. The only way to win is with a small force filled with the strongest enemies of Acknowledge, the Dragon Slayers. And that's why we need your help, Jin continued. Acknowledge has been held on a tight leash for a while now, but we've noticed recently that the beast has been poking around near our borders. We don't know why it kept retreating, but we have to assume Ziref called it back. But in the past week it has gotten far more brazen in its attempts and takes longer and longer to leave. Ziref's control over the beast is slipping. You've yet to tell us why we should help, Hades cut in. It's true that Acknowledge is a threat, but we are the ones with the Dragon Slayers, not you. All you have is a single Dragon Slayer, and while he may be Inukin, we can always substitute him in this plan with Ichigo. From what I have seen so far, Ichigo is stronger. Stronger maybe, God Serena reluctantly conceded. But how much energy does it take for him to harm the beast? Far more than it would for me. In practical terms, against Acknowledge I am superior because my magic will break through Acknowledge's defenses with far greater ease. The only way to kill a dragon like this is to use its natural enemies, not strong mages like the mages of old believed. Pressing a hand against his chest proudly, God Serena continued with, and what better mage is there to fight it but me? The greatest dragon slayer of them all. If we combine my power with your own dragon slayers, victory is assured. I have seen them fight and their skill is sufficient to enable them to combat the beast by my side. The sound of chair being pushed back set everyone on edge, only to find Jin slowly getting out of his seat, taking a last sip of his tea before placing it back down on the table. You don't need to give us your answer yet. Take your time, think it over, and when you come to an answer please send a Dragon Slayer out alone towards our forces. Our men have orders to not attack if they see one of your Dragon Slayers approaching, and will let them through to discuss any further terms you might have. Beginning to turn away, Jin paused for a moment as if a thought had crossed his mind. Putting on a wide fake smile, he gave them a wave before adding, "You should be quick in deciding though. We already have the method to draw Acknowledge out, but this window of opportunity will not last long. Once Acknowledge is done with our Dragon Slayer, he will ignore the rest of us and head straight for yours. Don't think that barrier you have will protect you from its charge. Decide soon," God Serena said as he moved to join his companion. "The stage waits for no man. If you do not agree to show, then the play will become mine alone. And you will not be happy with how the story ends." Protector of the Fairies. "Well, it appears my eyes weren't deceiving me," said a black-haired man as he walked into the throne room of the Quincy, only a single strand hanging down over his face. The usual attire of a stern ritter had a few modifications to it on him, with baggy pants and 3 layers of silver armor around his neck and shins. Looking up at the form of his emperor, slumped against the back of his throne with his right eye closed, he added respectfully, "I am glad to see you are still alive, your majesty." Askin, Waiwak spoke, a groan of pain escaping his voice despite his best attempts. His body hurt, so much so that he couldn't even ignore it as he wanted to. "Are you the last? I think Pernida survived. He's on his way back now to check on your condition." He sounded worried when that explosion went off, but luckily it would take a much larger dosage than that to kill me. Raising a hand, he lightly gestured towards his king. "But what about you? How did you survive? And what of the remaining Quincy?" "No others remain," Waiwak stated. "They have all perished, by the hands of others or by Bambietta's own actions." "That doesn't explain yourself," Askin pointed out, his eyes slowly drifting till they were focusing on the now empty hole where Waiwak's left eye once was. "You don't look like you're at your best." Waiwak said nothing before he finally opened his right eye, turning it on Askin. Where the left eye was missing, the right eye was changed, now holding 3 visible pupils at first glance, each occupying a different area. "The Almighty. That is it, correct, right?" "Indeed," Waiwak answered for him. "I used its power to change the future, severing my body to all my Quincy and letting the energy detonate in front of me rather than within me. A necessary sacrifice to make, even if it means I will no longer be able to obtain Leal or Gerald's power. But with the Almighty now awaken, I do not need them." "Your power is sufficiently strong enough without them," Askin admitted without shame. "I doubt you even need me or Pernida anymore. But if I might ask, what happened to your other eye?" "This?" Waiwak asked, raising his left hand to his missing eye. "A sacrifice, you might say. The battles today pressed me too much, and in my arrogance I believed I was undefeatable even though my power was still recovering. Ichigo was on the run with Uriah, the fools sent from Alvarez were dead at my feet, and all that remained was a lone Quincy who had little left to use against me. I had no believed for a second that any other threat nearby would require my full strength any further, and so utilized it freely to crush them all. So when Bambietta pulled her little stunt, I could no longer call forth the Almighty as I was. I had overtaxed my own abilities and created a weakness of my own making. Since it was taking too long to recover its strength naturally, I decided to force it to awaken. Would you like to guess how?" "You gave up your eye," Askin assumed. "Sped it up." "Indeed," Waiwak replied as he lowered his hand back down. "I forced the power to awaken once more in my left eye despite my condition. It burnt away the eye as a result, damaging it beyond repair and leaving nothing behind. But for the time it took for it to burn away, I had my full power running through that eye. Stopping Bambietta's last-ditch attack was child's play after that. Do not think my power was weakened as a result," Waiwak warned, noticing the curious look on Askin's face. "One eye is more than enough for me to utilize the Almighty. Giving up my left eye has only made me stronger through the experience and wisdom that I have gained. Now tell me, when will Pernida return?" Askin shrugged. "I rushed back first since he said he had to check on something. Should be back in a day, I would think." "Good," Waiwak muttered quietly, closing his right eye again. "I must rest for a while. Ensure no more intruders come to disturb me. I would be disappointed if I was forced to wake up from my slumber too early." Askin gave a bow out of habit to his king as he responded. "As you wish, your majesty," he said before heading for the door, leaving Waiwak in silence once more. So many Quincy had been lost. His initial plans were in tatters, but with the Almighty he no longer needed that original plan. He had already been prepared to scrap it if he regained his power, but he hadn't anticipated it happening so early. It would more than make up for the loss of so many Quincy, in particular Grammy, who had helped fuel his war effort. The question was what his next step would be, though. He gazed forward and saw it. Plenty of possibilities, plenty of outcomes he could take and perform. But none yet allowed him to reach his prize. And then there was that darkness. Like a fog that light couldn't penetrate, he couldn't see past that point. 7 days, Whack muttered. The future has become dark to even me. A single thought remained as he slowly settled into sleep. What would happen in 7 days that not even his power could not perceive? Protector of the Fairies. Okay then, are you all ready? Kisuk asked, surrounded by his assistants for this task. He had decided to leave Hades to treat the others that needed treatment in an effort to keep this secret between as few people as possible, and, while he had wanted to share it with only one, he could settle with telling the 2 sky magic users in front of him. Giving a confident nod, Kelia looked ready to work. Her leg had finished regenerating a while ago, much to her joy, and her magic had managed to recover to much more satisfying levels after her fight with the gods. Wendy followed up Kelia's action with one of her own. The younger girl was looking in much better condition now. She was less tired for one thing and had a lot more magical power now too, thanks to her chance to rest, along with a new dress to replace her tattered one. Both of them also had one of the many spare operating coats he had found in the medical ward for the operation ahead. He didn't care much for the blood if it got on his clothes, but he knew girls at their age cared more about this kind of stuff, even healers like them. Small amounts wouldn't have been that bothersome, but he knew this operation had the potential of getting messy with all the work he would need to do. Before them all lay the body of Levi McGarden, still frozen in the kiddu he had cast a month ago. In just a few moments he would be bringing down the kiddu for the first time since then, and when it happened they would not have long to work. Bones had to be broken and reset, blood had to be restored to replace what would be lost in the operation, and organs would need to be healed from where the bones ruptured. It was not an easy job, but it was one he had to believe they could do if they wanted to save this girl. Okay then, he said before he began to draw his sword from his cane. To the other sides of Levi he could see the familiar energy of healing magic lighting up their hands, preparing for his signal. That was good, he wanted them ready to act immediately. Looking at his blade, he couldn't help but smile fondly at it for a moment. This would be the first time he would be using his Bankai to directly save the life of another like this. Bankai. As the cube of green energy shattered around Levi, a new shape formed from his freed-up magical power. A giant woman began to fill the space of the room behind him, pressed heavily against the sides and ceiling of the room, with dark braided hair arranged into loops on her head. Her arms were more like those of a mannequin's while her body was dressed in a revealing robe. Immediately the arms of the woman shot forward, reaching towards Levi's body and making contact. Everything it touched was split open, as if cut into by a knife to expose the inner workings of Levi's body. It didn't matter even if her clothes stood in the path, as they too were split apart at the woman's touch, parting with the flesh without issue. Wendy and Kelia immediately set to work with the task he had wanted them to. Restore the blood and maintain her vitals. He could handle everything else so long as Levi could survive long enough. The second power of his Bankai began to kick in and the bones began to be broken and fixed, cut, and stitched back into place with careful precision. This was the power of his Bankai, Kanan Bairiki Benihimeratum. It could make an object split wherever the hands touched and then stitch it back together however he wanted. Rearranging the structure of something, optimizing it for better use, it was all within the capabilities of his Bankai's power. For the badly set bones, all he needed to do was cut them at the right place and begin stitching them back into their proper place. Natural healing could be sped up after he was done with the help of Wendy and Kelia if needed. Piece by piece, he began to stitch Levi back together. Special care had to be taken with her spine. He knew he could not only save her but also avoid having her paralyzed for life, however that only would happen if he repaired the damage correctly. Bones needed to be pulled free from organs, so he cut the pieces out and stitched not only them back but also the organs shut to repair the damage they had taken. Her left leg was where the problems hit in. It was as he initially thought when he first looked over her. Even if he could cut and stitch the pieces back together, it had already been shattered into so many pieces. But he could try. It was almost like working on a jigsaw in his mind as he pulled each piece back into place, stitching it back up. Even when he finished work on the leg, however, he knew it wouldn't be the same. Something broken never could be as it was initially, and no matter how much he returned it to its original shape, it would not remove the fact that it had shattered once before. She'd be able to walk on it, but he wasn't sure how much power she'd really have behind it. Running might be tricky with it for all he knew, and he certainly didn't think it would be up to the same level as her right leg. Nonetheless, it was as good as he could fix it. His full attention began to return to the rest of her body as he went to work tidying up what little he had left. The remaining bones were stitched back into place until not a single one remained the way Levi had believed it was meant to go. A quick glance at Kelia and Wendy showed they were holding up still. Their expressions showed some trouble, but he doubted they found it pleasant to see Levi cut open so much like this. The only place he hadn't cut into was her face, and he would have hated to see their reactions to that. His work was done now. All that was left was the final stitches. His bankai slowly began to close up the flesh once more, repairing the flesh and even the clothes that were initially sliced open until all of Levi's body had been sealed back up. Switch from blood restoration to repairing the damage her body has taken, Kisuk ordered them. Even though he had stitched her bones back into place, he wanted to ensure that the body wouldn't need to stay still for months for the points where he stitched shut to heal naturally. With each second that passed, the areas he had stitched became joined naturally once more, and he found that he could dismiss more and more of his bankai's stitches. Finally it was done, his bankai fading away behind him. At his orders, Wendy and Kelia remained in the room and continued their work, dealing with any remaining issues and doing their best to bring Levi closer to full health faster. If they encountered any more problems, he was only a moment away. But first he needed to step out. Exiting the room, he found the one individual he had expected to see standing facing the door. "Well?" Ichigo asked, trying and failing to hide the desperation in his voice. Kisuk could have made a joke at that, but he didn't feel like distressing his student in a situation like this. "She's fine," Kisuk said, a large smile of relief appearing on Ichigo's face at his words. "She'll make a full recovery. Or at least as well as can be expected. She may have some problems with her left leg for a long time, her whole life even, but she'll be able to walk and do whatever she wishes so long as she learns her new limits. Make sure you tell her that when she wakes up." "When will she dash?" "I'll let you know when she's awake," Kisuk said as he cut Ichigo off. "Don't worry about her right now. You should probably save that for later on." "For what?" "The hollows," Kisuk said with a sigh. "Once I'm done here, I'll tell you everything we know so far. Hibiki is gathering any necessary information we need for us all so we can all decide on our next move. We can't provide the same level of support until all of us are able to fight again, so until then we have to hope that our allies haven't made any foolish decisions yet while the hollows are gathering." "All right then." Pausing for a moment, Ichigo glanced down the hallway to the other room they were using as a makeshift medbay. "How's Yuzu doing? I heard something happened to her, but by the time I got there after we were done fighting it seemed the danger had passed." "She's..." Kisuk shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry. She's alive, but barely. If your father hadn't noticed the explosion near us and had rushed to check it out, I'm not sure we would have found Yuzu in time. But even so, the damage was extensive. Wendy and Hades managed to pull her back from the brink of death. How they managed that I'm not sure, but it was close. From what Hades told me, it was like a bomb had gone off in her chest, and she had probably only managed to hold on for so long by using her script to get a soul strong enough to save her." "Will?" Ichigo's voice broke for a moment, his hands tightening into fists with anger directed at foes far away from them. "Will she recover? Hades and Wendy saved her, but what was the result?" Kisuk sighed again before placing a hand on Ichigo's shoulder in an attempt to comfort him. Even repairing as much damage as they could, it was too late for some things. "She'll probably always have a weak heart from now on, so she should take it easy with her actions from now on. She'll probably have a faint scar on her chest too from the damage done. But according to Hades, she'll never store large amounts of magic in her body ever again. Is she at risk from dying because of that?" "No. So long as even a slither of it remained, even broken, she would have been fine. But her life as a mage is over. Because she's a Quincy, she may still be able to gather energy and utilize it in some forms, similar to what you've told me your Edala's self could do. But she'll never have the same strength she once did. Is Heinz talking about moving her to safety further within the barrier once she's awake and away from the front lines in order to keep her safe? But telling her that and having her watch the rest of us go back to battle may be tough on her. I see, Ichigo muttered. But she's alive, right? That's all that matters. Do you want to see her now? Ichigo shook his head. I should let her rest for a bit longer. Besides, we are still at risk here, and the sooner we plan our next move the better. We still have no idea what to do with the Genesis, and I doubt we can get it into the barrier easily, but we can't afford to leave it unguarded out here too for the enemy. I'll have a chat with Hibiki. See if he has any suggestions. That'll be best. I'll join you in a bit. Sure. See you in a bit, Ichigo replied, beginning to take a step towards the door before spinning round and pulling Kisuke into a hug. Thank you, by the way. For saving Levi. Having us all live, even if we lost today, is something I can't express how happy I am about. I'm your teacher, am I not? Kisuke replied with a chuckle. You can always rely on me if you need me. Still. Thank you. If she'd died. Ichigo shook his head as he pulled away. I'll need to go and tell Laxus the good news after this too. He'll be over the moon. Protector of the fairies. So what's the situation? Urza asked as the last few members trickled into the room. Orga had decided to stick around for the moment, while Wendy and Kelia had decided to listen to the meeting through Hibiki's archive link, prioritizing their patience for the time being and allowing Hades to join the meeting personally. I haven't had a chance to hear much on the state of the northern battlefield. Not much we can say about it honestly, replied Hibiki as he brought up a few maps of the area to show them. Currently the major guilds present are Mermaid Heel and Lamia Scale. The former has been lacking access to Yuzu and Karen for a while now, and while Karen may be able to fight again, the same cannot be said for Yuzu. While Mermaid Scale does still have Kagura, she alone is not enough to give the help necessary to turn the tides. What about Lamia Scale? Asked Gray. What's their condition? Holding strong currently, Hibiki replied. Jura has proven time after time that he is capable of holding back even the more fearsome of hollows with his legendary spell. He's not a wizard saint for nothing. Unfortunately, there will be simply too many hollows this time for his power to make the kind of difference we want. When Ishin returns to the battlefield, we should gain the advantage, but his loss is hurting them, and while Yuaki has tried to make up for that, she alone is not enough. How much has changed since I left? Ishin asked as he pressed Hibiki for answers. Hollows have been gathering and sent packing for weeks now, but from these numbers you're showing us, they are in a far greater mass than ever before. Indeed. Widening the maps to show more land, Hibiki let the dots of red fill the screen until there was nothing but solid color in the enemy's positions. Going by their numbers, there must be at least 100,000 hollows, and that number is growing. Our forces were being torn apart by a much smaller number, and with this many hollows, the odds have become twisted for us. There are even more Minos Grandes gathering than ever before, and some of the high readings we are getting even suggest they are sending out a large number of their strongest hollows. From the information I've gathered and the opinions of Yuaki and Jura, it appears likely that this is the entirety of the Hollow Army. On that day, all of the hollows of Hueco Mundo will go to feast, Ichigo muttered softly. Hibiki, what does the battlefield look like? How much sand is there? Honestly? A lot. More than there should have been. The land is almost unrecognizable now, covered in that layer of desert sand. The words of that hollow are starting to ring true from the sound of it. Just what we needed when we have the matter of Acnologia hanging over our head. The sand has yet to invade the barrier at this point in time, Hades pointed out. Until that happens, we are safe, and for the moment we can put aside the matter with Acnologia. Which means we still have time to work out how to deal with this mass of hollows. How about with that power Ichigo showed earlier? I have to admit, I find myself quite curious about it. I'm sure from what I was told, the energy cloak Ichigo utilized against Zeref was his Bankai. The smirk on Hades' face didn't lessen at all at the confused and suspicious looks on the other mages, all directed towards Ichigo. I may be wrong though. I only received second-hand information, but I do find myself wondering how you could change your power so much. Hades almost jumped back when Mavis appeared right before his face. I know what you're doing, she snarled at him. Acting innocent won't hide the fact you're fishing for information that you don't need dash. It's fine Mavis, Ichigo said calmly, the girl keeping up her glare with Hades for a moment before floating back to his side. I suppose people are curious. I anticipated this happening the moment I used it in fact. What I used today against the gods is Tensou Zanjutsu. My Bankai. And so what was that other form? Miss Dogen asked. You used it against both the dragons and Zeref and even Aknologia. It was powerful. The speed and strength are completely different however, Urza added. I haven't seen him use what we thought was his Bankai much bar what I could see in the distance against the dragons, but he was not as fast as he was today. He was more noticeable back then though, Taoshiro pointed out. Today it was like he vanished to my senses. When he used that other state, he released so much energy that it covered the sky in darkness and cloaked himself in a mass of it. But today, nothing. At least nothing that lingered. That other state of mine, Ichigo answered for them all, is, well I guess it's hard to give it a name. It is Bankai, and yet it is not. I guess the closest comparison I have to anything is a technique my Edala's self used called Let's Still. So that's it, Ryukin stated calmly from the side. I understand what he did. Understand. Orga frowned at the man. Have you even seen his Bankai or that other form before? No, but the name of that technique is one I have heard of. Before Volstandig was created, it was a Quincy method of forcing the body to absorb energy quickly, trying to take us beyond our set limits. It wasn't nearly as powerful for normal Quincy though, since to make full use of it you would need a much stronger connection to magic itself. The ambient energy in the air was not enough for us to fully make use of it, but if Anukin was to utilize that technique, I'd have all the power and pull necessary to maximize its power, finished Ichigo for Ryukin. He's right on what it does. The shape and appearance may change, but the core of Let's Still is to gather energy at a rapid rate and pull it into a central focus point. My Edala's self turned that point into a mix of a cape and quiver. I instead wrapped it all around myself and turned it into a cloak of energy to hide myself within, my whole body becoming the focus point. With such a mass of energy to pull from, I could create blades at incredibly fast rates compared to my normal speed and could even compress some of that energy down into my body through absorption to increase my physical abilities drastically. You said it was still Bankai however, Hades pointed out. Why? Unless. Oh. That's clever. What is? Asked Orga. What did he do? He used the energy of his Bankai's release, answered Nozomi for him. Bankais are massive amounts of energy that gets shaped into the necessary form. Ichigo was probably only doing the first step and then gathering up all the energy with Let's Still, creating the illusion of a Bankai. That's right, said Ichigo. Any Shinigami can do the first step, it's just a waste if you don't carry through with it because it means all that energy is just released into the air with no direction. My Edala's self suggested the idea as a way to allow myself to fight at a higher level without having to rely on my Bankai, and honestly I prefer it more. The downside is the time limit since I have to rapidly absorb energy to my body and the cloak, taxing my abilities massively and putting a large amount of strain on my body. My actual Bankai. Well it's. You can't control it, Uriah stated. I was watching. You were flying all over the place. Are you sure you were seeing that right? Asked Gray. He was kicking the hell out of those gods. He split Gerald in half, and if they didn't have such pesky abilities he probably could have taken them alone. No, he wasn't in control, said Urza to Gray's surprise. When Leo launched a surprise attack on him, before that Alvarez mage stepped in, he had all the time in the world to stop him. But he didn't swing his sword. He was going to let Leo hit him rather than try and swing. What? That's not. Gray paused as he realized what Urza was saying was true. He had seen that same sight and had felt a similar feeling at the time. You're right. He was hesitating. Why? You lot were in the way, Ichigo replied awkwardly. The reason I don't like my actual Bankai is because I can't actual control my speed like I can in Let's Still. I was hoping using that form would help adjust my body more to it, but the compression between the two is still far too different. I could have cut down Leo easily, but in the process I would have also cut all of you in half since I wouldn't be capable controlling my strength and moving fast enough to stop him. And that's why no one could sense you, Hades added in. What your Bankai does, correct me if I'm wrong here, is compress your magical power down into your body. Absolutely. There is no energy that is left uncompressed here, it is all shoved deep down until nothing is given off from your body. If you could master such power, you could very well have done far more today. And instead Waiwak has ended up with his full power again if the report from Uriu is correct. People have mentioned this quite a bit, Taoshiro began, but what is Waiwaka's full power? What kind of power is it? We don't know. Just that it's enough to make him feared and that it was named the Almighty. Unless our residency Quincy no more. He paused for a moment to glance at Uriu and his father, both shaking their heads, before continuing. Well, our knowledge is pretty limited. But what we do know is that Waiwak is now a threat equivalent to his legend. So I'll ask this. Why did you not train more so that you could use your Bankai against Waiwak? And where exactly would I train this? Ichigo asked. I did too much damage in the Holy Palace the first time I used it, and by the third time I had to abandon the idea entirely and search for other methods. And since then I have had little time, plus anywhere I do train in would need to be large and isolated from any life to avoid having me kill people by accidentally swinging too fast. Finding somewhere was not exactly an easy task. A fair point. And I can understand why you wanted to hide it, a final trump card is always valuable to use and this one ever more so. But you didn't even tell us. If I was to take a guess, you simply didn't trust us with the knowledge. I told him not to tell anyone, said Mavis angrily before Ichigo could say anything. I didn't want him using it or anyone expecting him to. Do you understand how much pain he has to endure when he uses it? Mavis dash. No, Ichigo. Snapped Mavis as she cut him off. They will want you to keep using it if you don't say anything. To force yourself to adjust to it faster despite the cost. Her head snapped back towards Hades before more words broke free with her anger. Take the entirety of Ichigo's magical power and shove it down into a human body with human limits. Regardless of how well he trained his body and how well it developed with his magic, his body is still a human's body. He's not like Aknologia who passed those limits by becoming a dragon. When you take all that energy and shove it into a container that is completely and utterly human, something is going to break. Do you understand now? She snapped as faces of realization and horror appeared on some of the faces around her. His bones break and snap under his own power, crushed under the same intense force that gives him that strength and speed. And then his regeneration kicks in and heals them back up only for the same process to happen again and again and again. He may be faster and stronger but he is also more likely to make mistakes at such speeds too, and with his regeneration so taxed on fixing the constant damage his entire body is taking it has little left to spare for any mistakes he might and will make. His Bankai is not a trump card but a card of last resort when every other option, every single possibility, has been exhausted. Do you understand now? Crystal, Hades replied back, satisfying with the knowledge he had gained. I merely wished to understand. If he doesn't wish to use it, it is his choice. Or rather yours from the sound of it. Regardless, he will do what he thinks best. Good. Might we all get back to the matter of the hollows then? They are the pressing threat. In a moment we can, Hibiki said as he tried to calm the girl down. But first, there is probably one more elephant in the room that we should address. I would have asked in private but I think we all have a right to know this. What is it? You're going to demand more from him? Or whether he's keeping some other secret card up his sleeve? Not from him, Hibiki said before pointing at Mavis herself. From you. Hibiki Kisuk tried to say a warning before Hibiki raised a hand to cut him off. I'm not surprised you are trying to warn me, Kisuk. I figured you probably understood some of this, but I think we all deserve to know what we are fighting for. Why so many people are dying. Things have been becoming clearer for me for a while now but I want confirmation. Turning back to Mavis, he asked her a single question that he knew just from looking at her that she did not want to answer. Mavis Vermilion. What exactly are you? Protector of the fairies. The light that guides history. I'll ask again, Hibiki said. Mavis Vermilion. What exactly are you? As much as this might be fun to ask, Hades said as he took to his feet, one hand gesturing to the side where Orga and Urza stood, might we at least do this in better company? I hardly think these two are suitable to be there, even if one is a member of my old guild. Can't we be curious too? Asked Orga, scratching the back of his head at the silence. If it's going to be troublesome I can head off. I'm fine so long as I'm pointed at the enemy. So long as I know which side is good and which is bad I'll be fine. If this is related to the first master, Urza stated, then I feel Laxus as the current master should be involved in such discussions. Otherwise I will have to insist on being present to inform him of such developments. They should have a right to stay, argued Gray for them. After everything that happened today, after they risked their lives to help us, we shouldn't just be able to send them away now that it isn't convenient for us anymore. This is sensitive information, Gray, Kisuk replied. Information is the key in battle and it is understandable that many of us would not want this to spread. If they leave now they'll be filled with too many questions and might seek them out themselves, Hibiki argued. Then we'll have an even bigger problem on our hands. But they dash. Let them stay, Mavis replied faintly as she turned away, her form falling back till she was resting on the edge of the table and swinging her legs off it. Well then. Ask your questions. Very well. It's the same one. What exactly are you? Mavis gave a huff for a moment before pushing off the table and onto her feet, spinning round with a smile plastered across her face. I am a consciousness of magic, formed from a magic so complex that new life was created by it in order to control itself. I took on the form of a young girl who died and began to interact with the world for a time, as you probably heard of in history. I was the first master of fairy tale, their great tactician, and helped make them great. And afterwards, I faked my death knowing people would question a girl that simply didn't age. In truth I was growing bored with life and didn't want to bother with the whole aging process. People were already taking note of my appearance for the wrong reasons and it grew tiresome to keep up the act forever. That's the edited version, Hades said to Hibiki with a smirk aimed towards Mavis, taking pleasure in the way her smile dropped from her face to be replaced with a glare. In truth she had little choice but to disappear. She had an artificial body that became cursed and forced her essence to become separated from her body as a result. Her body has been lost ever since that day, probably stolen to some far-off land or perhaps even destroyed at some point during these many decades. Is that true? Hibiki asked Mavis, the girl pausing for a moment before nodding her head. Hades shouldn't believe her body was lost. In fact he should still believe it was under Magnolia. He couldn't have forgotten that, so was he lying on purpose to keep that a secret? The look he gave her confirmed it though. Now then, I suppose the question Hibiki really cares about is what kind of magic you are exactly. It's obvious the enemy knows because they wouldn't go to war for an unknown such as you. They are risking a lot all for the sake of obtaining you, which means your worth to them is more than all the lives of their soldiers that have perished. You don't throw that much away for something you don't know the truth about. I'm an old magic, that's all that really matters. Oh, I wouldn't doubt that. Even when alive, you were odd. You always knew just how to win a battle and how to move things the way you wanted them to be. I never had a chance to ask you back then, but do you remember the Battle of Magnolia during the trade wars? When we were outnumbered heavily as the enemy side attempted to throw everything they had to break us. I remember. They believed they would gain a large advantage if I was no longer interfering against them. The thing is, looking back on that day I can hardly believe we all made it out alive. They pulled card after card on us, trap after trap, and yet we were prepared for every moment. Or rather you were. I remember seeing you watching the army from high above, with eyes so cold and ancient, before issuing commands that never failed us that day. By the end of the day the war had been decided the moment we broke the enemy's forces, but I never had the courage back then to ask you how you managed it. I was smart enough to outmaneuver them. That's all there is to it. Oh really? Yes, really. If you're done, Hades, Hibiki asked, stopping the two before they broke down into a combination of stares and retorts. I have my suspicions, but I would appreciate a straight answer. If you want to tell us now and save me some time. He paused to give Mavis a chance, but she remained silent, much to his disappointment. So be it. Swiping out with one hand, a large screen appeared behind him for all to see. This is a map of Waiwaka's base, he explained in response to some of their confused expressions. I've compressed the levels down to one map just so we can see an overlay. The full scope isn't necessary here. Snapping his fingers, a set of 3 red dots appeared on the map along with a set of 2 blue dots. This is where things get odd. What point in time is this? Uriu asked cautiously. And what do those dots represent? Funny you should ask that. This is during our retreat, when we all had to evacuate as quickly as we could. And these dots? Well, the red is Ichigo and the blue is you. Uriu paused for a moment, ignoring the looks sent his and Ichigo's way before replying. I'm sure you're aware of how Ichigo managed to pretend to be in 2 locations at once. Back then he utilized his Edela's self, but a simple illusion will do if you give it enough magical power and someone to control it. I'm sure you can pick up the lingering energy of Mavis in our own energy as a result. And the third here? That'll probably be old man Zanjitsu, Ichigo muttered quietly. Waiwaka caught up at one point. The old man summoned himself out from my inner world using what little power and form he had left thanks to Mavis's help, and tried to keep Waiwaka back for as long as he could before he faded away. Permanently. So that is what occurred there. Turning back to Uriu, Hibiki added, but you see, I'm not convinced that much by your explanation, Uriu. First, there are the discrepancies between these different readings. They are pretty small all things considered, and could very well be a result of interference, but it's odd how the readings I'm getting from one set seem to end up in the same state that the others begin at. What's your point? Nothing yet. Just worth noting at first. I barely paid any attention to it myself, but then something odd occurred to me. Those messages you sent me. They were instructions, Ichigo pointed out. Instructions we needed to get to you in order to make a successful evacuation. And I understand the need for that. I'm not against what you did, Hibiki replied quickly. But rather it's the odd nature of them. You very quickly changed your mind on what you wanted us to do in regards to you two. You wanted us to leave at a very specific time, and when you sent the second message you stressed that matter even more regardless of if you two would be safe or not. And again, nothing that set off alarm bells. Until I realized that the second message came from these dots. To emphasize his point, Hibiki gestured towards the dots closest to the marked sun gate on the map. Is there some significance to that? Orga asked as he stared at the dots from the sideline. I wasn't there, so is that meant to mean much? A bit more context might help then, Hibiki replied calmly, snapping his fingers as another dot appeared on the map, this one green. This is representing Waiwaka, he said as he gestured at the dot, showing how it was close to the dot representing Zanjitsu. Now, watch what happens. With another snap of his fingers, all the dots began to move. At first Waiwaka was pretty much stationary on the map while the other dots were moving. That changed quickly though when the dot representing Zanjitsu faded from view, leaving the dot for Waiwaka chasing after the nearest red dot. This continued all the way until the red dot met up with the blue dot, all the while a pair of red and blue dots kept moving towards the marked gate. These dots vanish here, Hibiki stated, observing how the dots near Waiwaka faded away before the dot immediately went in pursuit of the other dots. With another wave of his hand the screen vanished, its purpose fulfilled. At that point in time, the dots for Ichigo and Uriu there vanished entirely. And it's at this point that they begin matching up with the others. With another wave of his hand, a new screen formed of the same map. The same display began to play for them all until it reached the same place. The only difference was that there was no movement towards the sun gate from a second set or a dot representing Waiwaka. No one quite understood what Hibiki wanted to show them initially. But the moment the dots then began to follow another familiar path, they began to realize. Hold on, Urza muttered in shock. That path. That's the same path the other group of them was taking, Taoshiro stated, his eyes wide at the implications. I see, Hades said in interest as he leaned forward, gesturing with his hands for the display to repeat itself. Watching the display run through again, he let out a small chuckle at the sight. It looks confusing in the initial display, but when you put their actions into a linear path like this, ignoring the current moments in time and instead purely considering the path taken, they match up perfectly. And yet these moments were happening simultaneously, you say? Exactly, came Hibiki's reply as he turned back towards Ichigo and Uriah, letting the display stay visible for all to see to emphasize his points. Maybe separately I might have considered other possibilities, but there is too much here that leads towards other hypotheses. The fact these illusions as you claim them to be end up perfectly matching the signatures of the start state of you two at these points, the fact these paths map out perfectly when we don't consider time as a factor here, and then there is this war itself. How the hell is that a factor? Mavis demanded, holding her hands tightly together behind her back so that she showed no tension or worry to those around her. You could link just about everything to this war. We could, Hades conceded as he cut in before Hibiki could. But that is the point. Uriah, your explanation about the illusions was clever. How long ago did you prepare that answer? But there is an important factor in there that you overlooked. The fact you felt the need to explain away the reasons why Mavis's energy was intermingled with yours and Ichigo's. You already had that answer prepared because you knew that was the real reason for my questioning on the dots, Hibiki continued, shooting a thankful look to Hades for the support. You knew that any answer you would give would be torn apart if I mentioned about Mavis's energy, without even being sure that I would ask about it specifically. To avoid that, you crafted a clever lie built on what we already knew and hoped that we were merely trying to bluff our way through. Now how does this link to war? Hibiki asked as he turned to face Mavis directly. You, Mavis, are what the enemy wants. We already said this, but for them to risk so much for you, you must be a prize beyond measure. I won't pretend like I haven't wondered what exactly you are for a long time now, but looking at all of this and knowing that the enemy wants you more than anything, I think I can take a good guess. You're Dash. Don't say it, Kisuk warned, a dark look on his face that was met by a determined glare. This is a lid you do not want to open. A secret cannot be unheard once known. A shocking truth cannot simply be brushed away as a lie afterwards. No matter what your guess is, keep it to yourself. Do not ask. We should not know. Did they tell you that? Hibiki asked. Perhaps I can see the logic in that, but I don't care. I want that confirmation to know exactly what we are fighting for. Turning back to Mavis, taking note of the panic she was doing her best to hide in the face of all of this, he began to try and speak. But another beat him to it. What Mavis is, that is none of your concern. Ichigo had gotten out of his seat, one arm held out in front of Mavis and slowly shifting her further back so she could hide behind him. Hibiki, enough is enough. We have a right to know, Ichigo, Hibiki replied back with calmly, his words falling faint for a moment at the glare being put on him. Swallowing his nervousness, he pushed on just as confidently as before. Ichigo, she's Dash. What Mavis is does not matter, Ichigo replied with, just as coldly as before. You do not need to know to win this war. No one does. All you need to know is that Mavis is the prize the enemy seeks and we won't let them have her. That is all that is necessary for you to know. And what if I don't think that is not enough? Hibiki argued back. What if I still feel like we deserve our answers? I can't be the only one, right? He glanced around the room at the many signs of agreement or consideration of his side. We at least, in the heart of all of this mess, should know. Or are you willing to go to the extreme to stop us? There was quiet for a moment. No one wanted to be the one to trigger the tension between the two mages, more than happy to just wait it out and see what happened. Then, before Hibiki's eyes in fear, Ichigo's free hand came down to rest on the handle of his small sword. Is that your plan? If I keep talking, you'll threaten me. You have no right to demand secrets from anyone. We are risking our lives for her. You think that makes a difference to Waiwak or anyone else? Even if you weren't, even if you were living peacefully away from the war, you would suffer just the same. What makes you think that makes you entitled to secrets that aren't yours? Do you think Juoshiro would tell you the secrets of the Magic Council if you fought for him? Do you think the Queen would tell you what hidden truths the royal family knows if you risked your life for her sake? Of course not. And the same applies here. Says the one who surely knows all her secrets. Mavis must not have had a problem telling you. That was her choice. She wanted to. And when I learned, I knew that I would have rather not known. You do not need this knowledge. If you keep insisting on this, I'll... Ichigo's voice trailed off as he noticed Hibiki's continued resistance, his hand slowly leaving his sword. A bluff Hibiki slowly realized. One that Ichigo must have hoped would have made him back off, maybe even just from the shock and fear of it all. But the fact Ichigo had been the one to back down first only served to give him ground. What is she? I'll offer you the chance to say it first if you wish. But if you won't, I will. I won't say dash. A tug from behind caused Ichigo to pause, looking towards Mavis in confusion. Looking just as uncertain and worried as before, she still stepped out from behind him, her grip on him never slacking as she began to speak softly. Please forgive Ichigo for this, she started with quietly, many of them having to strain their ears to pick up her words. He only wanted to protect me. He could have told any of you if he wanted and I would have allowed it, but he still kept quiet because he wanted to respect my secrets as my own. But I understand that I'm being selfish, asking you all to fight for my sake and yet not offering my full trust in return. You don't have to say this, Ichigo told her softly. Don't let them pressure you into this. He is right regardless, Mavis reluctantly admitted. My wants and needs are different matters here. They want answers, are desperate for them, so if that is what it takes then I'll tell them the truth. All of it. Letting out a sigh, she pointed at the display still on loop. You were smart to look at the path that way. That is the correct interpretation of events for us. From start to finish, we followed that path. It looks messed up when you try to show it in real time because you have the issue of multiple instances and the fact knowledge has been lost by looking at the time that passes in such a linear fashion. Can you bring up the first display? Waiting until the other screen was hovering beside the current display, Mavis gestured at the midpoint of it all. In the jails here, that is where you combined these two paths. Where one path ended and another began. In reality, that's because of the way you are looking at it. For us, one path never ended there. Raising her own hand, a small ball of light formed in her palm. That light quickly began to form a new shape in front of them, perfectly mapping out the shown map before them. A second copy appeared just as quickly, hovering over the first so that it perfectly overlapped it. New lines began to join to represent the paths, darker in color, before one path was on each map respectfully. And then, to finish up her construct, a single line going straight down formed between the two maps to connect the paths. Our path remained the same when you consider it another way, Mavis explained reluctantly. We reached that point and then continued on. What your displays miss out is the intermediate step that allowed this. Me. A more concrete answer please, Hibiki said as he pressed her further. This intermediate step. It's exactly what I think it is, isn't it? Mavis nodded. Even if you're wrong, it won't matter now anyway. The reason our path is so weird when shown normally and why it appears like we are in multiple places is because we were in multiple places. We reached one point, before moving backwards and continuing from that point at the same moments as we were trying to reach that initial point. Hold on, Gray muttered in shock. That's... No. That can't be possible. You're all starting to understand now, I see, said Mavis, ignoring the urge to retreat into herself at all the looks being shot at her. She didn't have to see every face to know what kind of look it was. Attention was something she was used to, but this was something else, something she didn't like. Lumen Histoire is, quite literally, the magic to act as a lighthouse for history. In shortened and clearer terms, there are two you are all probably familiar with. Time travel. No one spoke. No one could even if they wanted to. Just hearing those words had silenced anything that could have been said or asked, leaving them all in a mix of shock, curiosity, and awe. But nothing could last forever, and this silence was no exception. So it was that, Kisuk muttered. When you confirmed my previous suspicions that it was related to time magic, I'll admit I considered this possibility. But I didn't want to acknowledge it either. Letting out an annoyed sigh, he asked, I assume that no one else apart from those here and some of our enemy know. That's right, Ichigo stated. Generals, leaders, even Juoshiro and the Queen aren't aware of this. And now that you all know, I'm hoping you understand why they should not know. Time travel. Gray repeated the words in shock before rapidly shaking his head to clear his mind. That can't be possible. That kind of magic. It could change the world. It's simply too impossible to exist. It can, Wendy spoke up through the archive link, letting one hand rest over her chest where she was and brushing over the area where the lacrima was implanted. Nabara is something that can be considered impossible to. Able to change the very nature of someone, expressed simply as exchanging light and darkness. Like Lumen Histoire, Nirvana is another magic that could be considered impossible. There's a third too, Ichigo added as he offered up the piece of information. Spatial Aurora, wielded by the missing celestial spirit king that takes the form of a young girl called Zera. The ultimate expression of space magic, capable of even creating a new world and manipulating the very space that occupies it. I'm sure many of you might have at least heard of the celestial spirit world. That was a product of her power, utilized by someone with an unparalleled mastery of it. Mavis, Zera, Nabara, they can all be defined as impossible beings. But the enemy only wants Mavis, Hibiki pointed out, one hand resting under his chin as he considered the idea with interest. Fascinating really. With Zera the possibility that they could remake the world and start over does exist. And if they wanted to fully stabilize it as the true world, obtaining Nabara would make that possible. But in the end they have only expressed their goal to be Mavis from what we know. With her, they could reshape history to their will. Forget becoming a god in this era. They could reign forever if they wished, from the beginning of everything to the end. That's if they are after me, Mavis pointed out quietly. Baragan. I doubt he truly cares beyond making sure I'm not going to interfere in his plans. It's hard to know how much he even knows about me in the first place. With Zeref, he cares more about having me in his possession than actually using my magic. He would use it admittedly, but it's the lesser concern in his mind. Why whack though? There's no doubt which of them seeks my power the most. If you all don't mind, isn't there a more important question to ask? Orga asked, frowning at the whole situation. This is a power to travel through time. Even if some of the enemy want to use her to their own ends, the same question still remains. Why haven't we simply done the same? That's... Shinji frowned as well as he thought over the matter. You have a point actually. Unlike the others, we already possess Lumen Histoire. That was the whole reason the enemy began to attack as quickly as they did. They couldn't afford to wait around and give us time. But from the beginning we've been fighting instead rather than trying to utilize such power. With Mavis on our side, surely we could have known the enemy was coming and routed them at all turns. It's not quite that simple, Mavis stated to him. Maybe I should fully explain what Lumen Histoire is as a whole. That might help. Taking a deep breath to calm herself, Mavis let her thoughts gather before beginning to speak. Time is a complex thing. If I had to compare it to something, I would perhaps use the ocean here to describe it. It is full of billions of possibilities, each leading to more and more as time passes. Every action in the world creates a possible future, so when you combine that with all the people alive you get a number so large not even I can tell you what it is. But how does that affect us right now? Mavis asked with a knowing smile. Well, to continue with the ocean theme, the current series of events that occur are like the path of a boat. It is mapped out and the boat sails along that course. There have been many forms of time magic that have tried to manipulate the timeline and they cause what I would call waves here, shifting the boat around a bit on its journey. And yet the path remains roughly the same in many cases, only shifted drastically when the change that occurred was sufficiently large enough. Holding up a hand, Mavis quickly allowed a miniature illusion of the eclipse gate to form in the palm of her hand. Take the eclipse gate for example. Because of those that used it, the timeline was shifted slightly off its original course. The dragon invasion was stopped and the future result brought about by it was averted. And yet war still occurred. That has not changed, and I would bet that many events from that future have still been occurring even now. Similarities or matches to what Mest would have seen occur. Maybe the way they occur might vary, but the fact they still happen means that the wave made by the eclipse gate's presence and usage was not enough to shift what we call a world line. You say timeline and world line like they are two different things, Miss Ogden said curiously. Would you elaborate on that? Mavis shrugged. The timeline can be considered as the flow of time that we are currently following. It contains a record of all the events that led up to this point and all that will occur afterwards, and it can be altered, as I said. The world line meanwhile is different. You can change the timeline and still exist in a similar world. In the way I described it before, it would like a boat being hit by a wave but managing to correct itself back to its previous path, with just a small bump in its original intended path. But if you change the world line, you can end up with a completely different reality. Minor changes don't normally cause this. The only thing that can shift the world line from one to another is when an event so significant to the current timeline has been altered and it becomes unable to stay on the same path any longer. Rather than adapting along the same path, it's like a new destination has been decided and the boat is now shifting towards it away from the previous path. How does this relate to me, you might ask? Mavis let out a small sigh as she rid herself of the illusion in her hand and placed it against her chest. Because I am Lumen Histo-Ire. I am the lighthouse in this sea of time, directing boats away from the rocks. I am the light that guides history down the path my wielder and I desire. When you can travel through the entirety of time, it becomes very easy to find the events that fix the world lines and alter them. Time no longer becomes a constraint and instead becomes clay to the user, able to be molded into any shape they like. But it's not that simple, is it? Urza asked, crossing her arms as she leaned back against the wall in thought. I've heard rumors of claims of magic capable of manipulating time in the past, but all those legends never lived up to the reality. Tools capable of seeing into the future gave cloudy and uncertain visions. Items meant to rewind time only moved back a few seconds at great cost to the user. The list goes on. For a magic to exist that can allow someone to travel through time, it would require a source of magical power beyond measure. There is one, Hades stated. Fairy heart. Fairy heart? Is that like fairy law? Gray asked. He had heard about some of Fairy Tale's signature spells, meant to only be held by the current guild master, but this was not one he had ever heard mention of even in passing or rumor. I don't think anyone ever came across it. I don't expect you would have heard of it. I mentioned her body was missing, did I not? That is Fairy heart. A lacrima shaped into a human, with all the functionality that comes with it. For all intent and purposes, it is a true human body with one difference. The quality of immortality. It won't age because it is not truly living, and yet it functions as if it was. You must have seen how much magic a normal-sized lacrima can hold. Now imagine a human-shaped container that even takes advantage of a human's own ability to restore their magic given time and store immense amounts within themselves. Such a feat of creation is far beyond the skill of anyone I have ever encountered in my life, nor within the capability of anyone any of you will probably find in your lives too. Regardless, when it comes to magical power, then you can be sure her body's capacity exceeds your own by just measuring the amount of energy in a finger. Hades is right, confirmed Mavis as others looked to her for answers. My body was specifically made to grant me the greatest abilities necessary to utilize my magic, though personally I believe it was because my creator wished for me to be able to live normal lives and blend into society if I so wished. A normal lacrima anyway would have lacked the ability to hold the necessary magic for long-distance time travel without being the size of a country at the very least, so it required some alterations to my construction to take advantage of different abilities in living creatures. My body was the product of that, the first and only one of its kind, capable of holding so much magical power that some have mistaken it to be limitless or eternal. That is simply how much magic one needs to be able to traverse the timeline from one end to another. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't your body lost? Taushiro asked. Isn't that what Hades said earlier? How could something that holds that much magical power be lost? Surely people must have been able to sense it. Suppression seals could hide it for a bit, Mavis admitted. If you had a specially constructed chamber, you could potentially create an isolated space and hide my body in there if necessary. It wouldn't last forever though. As Fairy Heart, my body, is the lacrima that holds my essence, it also contains the essence of Lumen Histo-Ire within it. Regardless of how well you try and suppress the energy, all that will result is that you would have bound the energy within a prison it can't escape from. And when exposed to magic such as mine, it's only natural that the prison would be eroded away by the forces of time. Ignoring that fact, Mavis added on, there isn't as much to worry about on that front. Just because my body holds the essence, it does not mean it is usable by any means. I hold the true keys to its usage, since the magic alone isn't going to be much help to people, if they could even manage to unlock it and access it. You also need the mind to be able to plot a course through time, one that is unsaddled by the limitations of single views of the world and instead can comprehend the fabric of time itself. I am the consciousness of said magic, which means I have a greater understanding of what it is, what it does and how to use it than anyone else ever will. Pausing for a moment, Mavis quickly created a small sphere in her palm, shaping it perfectly into the form Fairy sphere would appear as. Then there is Fairy's sphere. Just because one can time travel, it does not mean it is safe. Exposing yourself to the flow of time is not a safe move. Fairy sphere is an impenetrable shield at such small levels, made that way so it can resist the flow of time and protect those within it from time's effects. Without it, the user would age rapidly from minimum contact until they turn to dust. What about fairy glitter and fairy law? Asked Nozomi. Those are spells made by you too, right? I just followed a naming convention with them for the most part, Mavis replied with a smile. They were pretty fun works to make. I based the shaping mechanism of fairy glitter off fairy sphere and created a new offensive form for such power to take. And with fairy law, I took the shielding aspect of fairy sphere and used it to protect one from the effects of the spell fairy law was based off, a judgment spell called law. They have nothing to do with Lumen Histoire's workings though. Anything else that played a part in it? Hades asked, his eyes looking like he was expecting an answer. Perhaps, foresight. Mavis sighed. Yes. Hopefully that will fulfill that long unanswered question of yours. When I was in my body, it was a simple matter to look at the world and instantly understand the current state of the timeline. The only exceptions occurred when someone, occasionally me, was trying to cause waves in it and shifted off its previous course. I'm guilty of that, changing the fate of some of the people I knew to save their lives this way. But once I start interfering too much, things become cloudy even to me beyond the immediately future. Merely seeing the future provokes change, and that is from a glance, so you can imagine how complex time would become when you are constantly peering through it. With that in mind, it's hard to see all events across history when you are directly interfering with events, so sometimes I wouldn't know the full implications of my actions until after things began to settle back down and I wasn't actively looking into the future like I did during battle. But with your body missing, a lot of that is unavailable to you, Hibiki pointed out with a frown. You said your body would be unable to be utilized for your magic, or at least not safely, but that doesn't prevent someone from trying to use you as a battery for some pretty worrying things. If you were hooked up to Etherian, for example, with that kind of power it could be fired endlessly. But the process of draining it would also give off a massive reading of magical power to anyone with keen senses. Etherian isn't the most subtle of charging processes if you are close enough, and its blast is hardly unnoticeable. Even if your body is missing, weapons like that can't be utilized in such a fashion without us knowing about it. Mavis nodded. Exactly. It's why I've never been too worried about its disappearance. It'll turn up eventually, and with Ichigo here I would have enough firepower to take my body back from whoever wants to utilize it for that kind of purpose. Even if that is the case, I think our priority should really be retrieving your body. Plus, if you had it, you would be capable of utilizing your full power once more, right? That's technically true, Mavis muttered. But that's not quite so easy. Why? Gray asked, a mix of curiosity in his voice with a small amount of confusion at her reluctance. I mean, with that kind of power, you could stop this war before it even began. Stop this whole mess from happening and save everyone. I am the magic, Mavis replied with simply. Despite how I may act, I am like Nabara in that respect. We, and even Zera, generally will use our abilities to the way our users desire. There are exceptions, generally driven by our own desires to protect them, but for the most part we allow them to choose what to do with power such as ours. So that means Ichigo dash. No, Ichigo stated sharply before Gray could even finish. Mavis is not a solution here. With that said, perhaps we should move back to deciding what our next move should be? You all know what Mavis is now. Are you all happy with that? Why? Gray asked, staring at Ichigo in response to his answer. Why is Mavis not an answer here? If we could find her body again, she would be able to take you back in time to before this all happened. You could stop all of this. Why would you consider that? I never said I hadn't considered it. I just said it's not a solution. So we should dash. But it is, Gray argued back before Ichigo could try and divert the topic once again. It's the perfect solution in fact. Looking around the others, he looked for their support desperately as he asked, don't you all agree? Messing with the past is dangerous, Urza stated. It would not be wise? Maybe, but is this war any worse than what future might occur as a result? Plus you can't tell me you wouldn't want to use this kind of power if you had the chance. Wouldn't you want to fix things for the better? Urza didn't say anything at first, but her momentary glance towards Mistogin said it all. Perhaps I might change, one or two things. Things I was sure that would have made the world a better place. Right. Glancing around for more support, Gray turned his gaze towards the others. Doesn't anyone else agree? Reluctantly, Toshiro raised his hand slightly. I think that it could be wise if done correctly. I know if I had such power I wouldn't be able to help but change a mistake I once made. But isn't that the problem? Asked Shinji as he glanced at Toshiro. Let me guess. You would save your old family, right? From yourself? But that would erase the events that lead to who you are now. A paradox, Mavis stated for them. It's a danger of time travel. If one isn't careful, the user of said power can become a paradox themselves if they erase the events that lead to them gaining such power. It is what makes messing with time so difficult. You can easily erase your own existence in the process of doing the smallest change if you affect too much. For our sake, Kisuke asked, what would occur if you and Ichigo went back in time to the start of the war? To your past self at least. They'd likely disappear, Mavis said helpfully. At least if we interacted with them. If we remain separate we can avoid each other and avoid causing issue, but if they were to spot us when we never saw them in our past and they realized who we were, they would cease to be. As the older existence, our existence would overwrite their own. You can typically get away with such actions when the knowledge won't ever be remembered by the past self but something they can comprehend and understand. That can't be avoided. But you can still change things. Mavis sighed. Yes. While that past self would disappear, it's not like we wouldn't be there. From that point onwards we would be able to fix whatever we wanted and ensure that the future went the way we wanted it to. Provided we hadn't caused too many issues down the line beforehand by creating that paradox. Then, and I have to ask this, what is holding you two back from doing this? The consequences aren't as large as they could be, and if all we need to do is find Mavis's body, then I'm sure I could engineer something to help with that. Folding his hands under his chin, Kisuke leaned onto them as he asked, so what is holding you back from considering this? Do you think we should do this? Ichigo asked, Kisuke shaking his head in response. No, but then that is because I still believe we can win right now, given the chance, and that there still would be problems we'd have to deal with even if we utilized Mavis. But I'm curious why you don't want to use it. You aren't as cold as I am, and I'm certain there are things that happened in this war that you'd want to reverse. Ichigo's mind flashed back to the village for a moment, his hands clenching into fists under the table before he slowly let them relax. There are. Then why? Because I shouldn't use it, Ichigo replied, not noticing as Mavis placed a hand on his shoulder in comfort. Lumen Histoire is the power to travel through time. All of it. Which is why I should never use it. You don't think you could change things? Ichigo shook his head. No. I would change things. But that's the problem, Kisuke. I would change things. And if I do it once, I'll never stop. Protector of the fairies. The fear of looking backwards. No one was quite sure what to say to Ichigo's declaration. Many were still reeling from the knowledge of Mavis herself, and those that had were struggling to understand Ichigo's words. You'd never stop? Mistogin finally asked for them all, confusion in his eyes at the certainty he had heard in Ichigo's voice. "Why are you so sure of that?" Ichigo sighed, closing his eyes in thought as he leaned back into his chair. So many memories were flashing through his mind right now, each of them a memory he had held closely to his heart for one reason or another. If you close your eyes and focus on nothing but your memories, what is the worst ones that appear before you? What is the greatest mistake you ever made? What is your greatest regret? What decision would you alter if you had the chance? What event would you change if you could do so? Can any of you tell me? Opening his eyes, Ichigo glanced at Miss Dogen curiously. How about you, Miss Dogen? What would yours be? I don't think I have anything I fully regret, Miss Dogen admittedly slowly. But if I had such power, I would prevent Jalal from becoming who he became. Whether that meant I rescued him from whatever pushed him down that path or if it meant that I would kill him to prevent his rise. Even if that meant your own existence would become a paradox. Miss Dogen nodded. Even if it meant I was just a remnant of that timeline, I would be happy if it meant the world was rid of him and the damage he caused. I see. Glancing around the room, Ichigo asked, any others? The other mages were reluctant to voice their thoughts out loud, waiting for someone else to take the initiative until finally one did. I'd stop the cultists of Zeref, Urza said finally, a conflicted look on her face. I personally am fine with my life, I am happy where I ended up, but so many people suffered and died because of their actions. That accursed tower should never have existed and there shouldn't have been so many people sacrificed for such an insane goal of building it. Even if meant changing my life forever, I'd think I'd be able to be happy if the hundreds of others that died got a new chance at life because of my actions. Well, aren't you a saint? Shinji said. He had tried to say it mockingly but it had only came out dryly when he realized he couldn't fault such a goal. I'd go back and kill Mayuri again myself. But I'd do it before he killed my previous family. I'm fine with the experiments, I'm not going to complain about the power I gained nor the benefit I got from it, but I'd personally rather that the others hadn't had to die. My grandma and Momo, Taoshiro muttered. I wish my magic hadn't killed them. Deliara, Gray snarled as he clenched his hands into fists. I would have made sure he was destroyed earlier so that he wouldn't have been able to roam freely for so long. So many people lost their lives because no one had been able to stop such a beast until Ur gave up her life to bring him down. I would have prevented my wife from going to the ruins of Waiwaka's palace, Ryukin said, surprising all of them that the older Quincy had broken the silence he had been maintaining for a while now. Uriah was the one staring at his father the most from his statement, but it didn't look like the Quincy wanted to elaborate any further. Wendy's voice came through the archive link hesitantly, sounding uncertain of her own words. It's not a thing I'd want to change so much. But if I could, I'd want to go back in time before my mother left me. I'd want to ask Grandini why she left me. To know if it was something that she had to do or whether it was something I did or... Her voice trailed off at her before she quickly added. It's not really that important dash. It is if it matters to you, Ichigo said softly. It is still something you would desire to achieve through Lumen Histoire if you had the power to do so. Just because you are only seeking answers it doesn't make it any less important if it matters to you. I have similar regrets like that, Nozomi offered after a few moments of silence. My Earthland counterpart. I never asked as much as I should have about his life before me. At that age I didn't care because I was more than happy that he was with me and I didn't want to push him for things he didn't want to talk about, no matter how much he tried to say that they were simply insignificant things. I knew he had regrets and demons in his past that he didn't want to tell me and I regret not being able to understand him in the same way he understood me. I'd go back and save Yuri's wife, Rita, Hades said to the shock of many of them. What? You thought I'd try to further my own goals? I don't need a reset button for that. If I was to use such power, I'd reach for something beyond my ability to grasp. Besides, did you think my heart was completely black? Sorry, but even I have some shred of kindness in me. No one said you didn't, Mavis muttered as she looked down to the ground. But even I didn't expect you'd say that. Considering the events that lead to Rita's death. That's something even I wish I could have prevented. This is all normal, Ichigo said as he looked around at all of them. Whether a goal is done because of a desire to save others or whether it is because of a personal regret, neither are wrong. But many of us never consider being able to change the events once they have occurred because we lack the ability to. It's easy to say we'd change something when we don't hold the power to do so. So instead we struggle forward, try to come to terms with the past, and forge a new path. I honestly believe that is the path we should always be focusing on rather than looking back. And yet you say you think you would never stop changing things, Mest pointed out. Holding out his hands at that the glare sent his way, he quickly corrected his words with, "Hold on, I'm not trying to make a jab at you here or anything. Hell, it's not like I'm the poster boy of moving forward anyway since I ran back to the past to try and get a better future for everyone. I'm just curious why you think you would change things when you claim to believe that we should always be following the path forward instead." Ichigo sighed, his glare softened until Mest could recognize an emotion he had seen many times in this same man in the future. Regret. How many things have gone wrong because of the decisions I made? Ichigo said, almost as if asking himself the question. Baragan's guild was a threat that I eliminated. Even if I was under my Hollow's influence for most of how it ended, it was still a result of my actions in trying to protect Fairy Tail. But if I had rejected that mission, then another would have surely been sent in my place. Maybe even a few people, enough to subdue that guild. If that had happened, would Baragan's anger have pushed him as far as he has gone because of me? He went this far because I was too strong for him to fight, and so he pursued that goal relentlessly. If the others had been weaker but still managed to stop them, would Baragan have ended up the way he did and caused part of this war? That's your biggest regret? Kisuke asked curiously. I'm surprised. I thought dash. No. I'm sorry. That's not my biggest regret, Ichigo stated quietly. It's one of them. Taking a slow breath, another image flashed in his mind, one of himself as a child. I'd prevent myself from going on that mission with my mother. Or at least prevent that Hollow from dealing the blow it did to her. Another image flashed through his mind, one of his Edala's self. I would have prevented the Edala's version of myself from dying as he did. I hadn't wanted things to end that way, not when he wasn't evil but merely an enemy. I had only wanted to save my friends and he had only wanted to protect his world. More recent images appeared at the forefront of his thoughts too, ones where he could only see innocence that had been caught up in his problems. I would save every one of this villagers that I was forced to kill. I would have never taken Laxus with me and let him fight Acnologia if it meant increasing the rate of dragonification in his body. I never would have taken Levi if it had meant she would have been broken that much by her battle. That's only some of them, Ichigo muttered as he looked back towards Mest. I have many, but I've always had to force myself forward regardless of them. I have to face forward, have to continue down this path, because if I try and go back I won't ever face forward again. I'll run and run forever, chasing after a future where everything is perfect without ever really opening my eyes to the world. Gesturing lightly towards Mavis, he added, that's why I can't ever use Lumen Histo Ire in the way you want me to. I can move forward because I don't consider it as a possibility. But once I use it once I have solved a problem of the past through it and considered it a solution, I'll never be able to forget that fact. It'll forever be a possible way to fix anything I have a problem with. It'll be slow at first, Ichigo admitted. I'd probably just change something small or something recent. I'd likely hold out for a while but eventually I'd go back and fix it. More time would pass and then I'd end up going back further to fix an earlier problem. Until eventually I'd be using it constantly as the first answer I think of. I'd run up and down along the timeline, fixing everything that I see as wrong and making sure everything is as perfect as can be and never suffered as a result of my actions. Pausing for a moment, Ichigo imagined the sight before him before he shook his head. That would only be the start. I'd go beyond my own life and traverse everything from the start to the end. The destruction of the Nervits? I'd prevent them from being wiped out by themselves. The war between the Quincy and the Shinigami? I'd ensure it never happened so they could live in harmony. And if that failed I'd go back further and alter the events to ensure that could happen. Then I'd run forward and check how the events are unfolding and find out the new issues. Again and again, again and again, I'd continue forever. So long as my instant restoration maintains my youth, for as long as I live, I'll be abusing such power. I would become a god. And no one, not even enemies like Wywak or Ziraf or Baragan, would be able to stop me. And the same goes for all of you too. Not one of you would be capable of preventing me from doing as I wished. Unlimited power without any restraint, Hades muttered, chuckling in amusement. Such power is appealing, but terrifying to those that don't desire it. The temptation is always there, always at the corner of your mind, offering a solution to all your problems. If you think you'd fall that far, I have to praise your own resistance to have avoided using it so far. But he has done, Hibiki pointed out, frowning as he looked towards Ichigo. You used it to escape Waiwaka's base. Doesn't that mean you've already started down this route? No, Mest said before anyone else, even Ichigo, could say anything to that. Trust me when I say that what he won't affect him. He still has the same look of stubbornness in him to move forward. The same stubbornness that could lead him to becoming a machine. You would be the expert on how he would turn out, Kisuk stated as he scratched his chin in thought. Perhaps. A chance of mindset? Of course, if it was like that then it would make sense. What would? Hibiki asked. He still used Lumen Histo Ire, right? He did, Kisuk conceded. But there is a very different meaning behind what he did and what he is afraid of doing. Which is? Which direction he is looking in. Of course, Hades muttered as he joined in. If Ichigo is afraid of changing events, it makes sense that he is wary to use Lumen Histo Ire to travel back in time purposefully. But that only applies when he is consciously aware that he is trying to interfere with pre-written events. But if he was never thinking of using Lumen Histo Ire in that way, if he considered using it from the start to achieve a future result, then it all makes sense. That's right, confirmed Mavis for the two of them. When we all needed to escape, Ichigo knew Waiwak would never let them escape. So he considered what methods he had to break free. And immediately he realized the only way was using Lumen Histo Ire. He didn't want to travel back in time to an event before what had already happened, so he decided from before we even made a run for it that he would travel back in time to that exact moment. If he ran for 5 minutes, he would go back 5 minutes. If he ran for 10, he would go back in time by 10 minutes. In essence, he was trying to stretch the time he had out further and utilize it the best he could. But he still time traveled, pointed out Orga. He still went back in time. If it's predetermined, Ichigo probably saw it differently to you, Kisuk offered helpfully. If his escape from that moment has been decided and he didn't plan to use Lumen Histo Ire to alter any event he already knew had occurred, he would be able to still look forward in his eyes because he has not acted on his regrets. By deciding to use it to escape, he kept himself looking forward even if he went back in time slightly. He wasn't lax on that either, as when he traveled back in time he stressed the need for us to leave as planned. In other words, he was ensuring that nothing would interfere with the past version of himself from performing the same actions and not being altered by the effectives of time travel. That's how I could use Lumen Histo Ire here, Ichigo explained calmly. Though honestly, it really helps that I already have a limit on how far back in time I could even go without Mavis's body. I simply don't possess enough magic to go back that far with Lumen Histo Ire, and that suits me fine. I don't need the power to change the past. Only the strength to move towards the future. So please, don't ask me to seek out the rest of Mavis's power and do something I don't want to do. I don't want to get rid of our enemies like that if it means an even worse foe will appear in this world. Hibiki stayed silent for a moment, most of the mages present looking to him to see what he would say. He didn't blame them considering he was one of the ones who pushed for this knowledge so much. And as much as he wanted to say otherwise, there was only one thing he could say to such words. All right. We won't ask you again. He hated the idea of throwing away such a valuable option. But if Ichigo couldn't trust himself to use that power responsibly, then nothing they said would be able to change his mind on that front. He could ask for another to use Lumen Histo Ire in Ichigo's place, but he knew that Mavis would never let that happen, even if any of them had the power to stop the enemy. Even if the journey was going to be tougher before them, they didn't have much choice but to follow it. We'll find another way. Thank you. I do appreciate it. In turn, you better find another way to win, Hibiki shot back. If you want to move forward like this, then you need to be responsible in working out what options we have. That's fine. I'm more than aware of what I need to do before this war will end. Protector of the Fairies. How does it look? Jura asked Yoryuki, the female wizard saint, sighing as she brought down the binoculars she had with her. They were both standing on a large pillar of earth that he had raised for the two of them to stand on, carefully trying to examine the enemy from a greater height. Not good, to be honest. Hell, I can't even count their numbers anymore. And there's enough Minos Grandes that I can't see past them any further except in some small gaps. I just can't understand what they are waiting for. They have more than enough numbers present so far. It is odd, Jura agreed. I can't quite understand what is going through their leader's mind. He's been quiet for weeks, any attacks made on the barrier barely a problem to deal with compared to his initial assault. Now he appears to be moving and brings what could very well be the entirety of his forces, and yet still no move is made. None of his actions make sense compared to the other enemies. Agreed. Crossing her arms, Yoryuki narrowed her eyes at the large Minos Grandes in the distance. What is he up to? He must have something planned, and it's got to be linked to this. He can't be considering brute force as the answer here. That might have worked before we had the barrier, but now that it's here we can easily pull forces from other battlefields. There's a limited number of teleporters out there and it'll take them some time, but we can gather our strongest if the worst comes and halt their push. All we have to do is hold our lines, which when the hollows are being funneled towards us is an easier task than trying to stop them swarming us from the center. Can't they still try and pull off the same technique I heard they did in their initial assault? If they managed to create a hole in the barrier? If the battle drags on long enough, the lingering protections against dimensional magic will fade if the hole remains open to the enemy. That's why we need to keep pushing them out at every turn. It's not a perfect solution, but it's... Huh. That's odd. You see something? Jura asked, watching as she brought her binoculars back up to her head and began fiddling with the lens attached to it. Turning his attention towards the hollows too, he was just in time to see the familiar sign of red appearing on the horizon, only in far greater quantities than any time before. Ah! Ceros. The barrage tore through the air in no time at all, impacting against the barrier and leaving nothing but a red haze across it. Just as the Ceros looked like they were almost done, another set hit and reinforced the fading energy, the process repeating again the moment the new wave of energy was almost depleted. Odd, Yoryuki whispered under her breath. Very odd. Bringing the binoculars back down, she frowned as she took a look at the barrier. No signs of damage yet, she said more loudly to Jura, the man's attention already on the barrier too. Couldn't see anything tiny and there's not much sign of anything big happening to it. A single Cero or even a few hundred won't be enough to break the barrier, Jura replied. At least not when they are spread out this much. Is Barragan trying to replicate Alvarez's assault when they broke through? They only managed that through a massive fleet of ships and cannons, and even then it took time. A hollow Cero is strong, but their strength is being wasted like this. And it's only a matter of time too until they run short on energy if they are wasting their efforts like this. That's why it's odd, Yoryuki pointed out. Before they fired the Ceros too, I noticed something behind them through one of the gaps. Or rather, I noticed a lack of something. For an army that is still gathering more troops, the battlefield behind them seems rather lacking. It's hard to make out at this distance, even with these binoculars, but I should have seen more than I did. Add on to that the fact the Minos Grandes are attacking now, and in a wave pattern like this to prevent us from seeing dash. That's intentional. Jura blurted out. It's true the hollows have organization of some kind, but these attacks don't feel that way. I would agree too if I wasn't already suspicious. It feels very much like they are trying to hide something from us. If I'm being honest, that might be their intention behind this attack. Rather than focusing on breaking through now, it feels more like they are trying to buy time and keep us in the dark. But why? Hard to say. If you think they are planning something though, our first priority should be to regain our sight. Pausing at the sight of the lingering crimson haze over the barrier, he crossed his arms in thought before adding, getting to them might be an issue though. There was a lot of hollows in front of the Minos Grandes. Enough that breaking through their lines will take time. We may have to return to ground level to work out a path to take, as I don't believe we will have much luck from this height with our vision blocked like it is. Agreed. We'll need to work out the fastest way to do this if possible. Handling the Minos Grandes is something I feel like I can do. Even getting to them isn't much of an issue with my speed, and if I use Shunkao on top of that, then I'll definitely have the power necessary to do so. The issue comes from if a strong enemy appears and I have to fight them while watching my back from every other hollow out there. For starters, I want you to dash. She cut herself off as her eyes glanced down towards the barrier's edge. Hey Jura. I'm in charge here, right? Until Ishine returns, you are. He officially stated that I remember, before vanishing with that friend of his. Do you know who he was? Not a clue, but then Ishine kept some things secret to everyone but those closest to him. And as friends go, I'm definitely there, but time has a way of dulling things. Whoever that man was, I'd never seen or heard of him before, and that is saying a lot with how talkative Ishine can be. But anyway, are you sure no one else has authority here right now? Jura frowned but nodded anyway. He informed a few of the major guild leaders before disappearing that they should expect to only follow your orders in his absence. I don't know what he told Juashiro or the queen, but at least amongst us we should be expected to follow your orders. And would anyone be foolish enough to not do so? Normally? Maybe. There are some idiots out there that like the idea of gaining honor from battle and victory. But most have seen what the Hollows are capable of, and I don't think any that's still foolish enough to challenge odds like this possess the authority or connections to go over your own commands. Trying to see what had gotten Yoriyuki so wary, he turned his focus away from her to look at what had captivated her attention. It didn't take long to spot them, not that he doubted he could have missed them. Most people tried to put a large amount of space between themselves and the barrier, which meant this small group of cloaked individuals was very easy to notice near the very edge of it. Ah. I see what has you so worried. Holding out a hand towards the binoculars, he asked, may I? Feel free, Yoriyuki said as she handed them over. I've gotten a look at them already. I don't recognize the insignia on their cloaks. Neither do I, Jura admitted, watching the figures carefully for any signs that he might recognize them or the group they were attached to. The black cloaks they all wore did little to help though, hiding both their bodies and their heads and making it impossible to determine anything about them beyond their size. That marking though. He frowned as he brought the binoculars back down, handing them back to Yoriyuki for her to take another look. Is that a hand? A right hand to be exact. An odd sign. Haven't seen any guild using it before, nor any organization that's a part of Ishgar. I don't like that I don't know who they are when they are so close to the barrier's edge. It's unnerving. Perhaps it's an organization made by those on the War Council? They have Ichigo in such a group. That's the point though. Why a second group? We already have some big names in that group, and every strong mage we know is encountered for. Has someone been holding out on us? Are they some kind of recon group? Juashiro should have told us if that was the case. Letting out a frustrated growl, she brought her binoculars back down and crossed her arms. I don't like this. I'm going to contact Juashiro. Better to double-check this. Pausing for a moment, she passed the binoculars back over before adding, keep an eye on them for me, won't you? Something feels off. Of course. Jura reached out to take the binoculars before they fell from Yoriyuki's grip. He was in no position to catch them either, not when he was feeling the same unpleasantness he was sure she felt too. Neither paid much heed to the abandoned tool, both heads snapping towards the source near the edge of the barrier. Without the binoculars they weren't able to see the details clearly at such a height, but that didn't matter. The information they wanted was also the most visible, a line of dark mist energy creeping up the barrier's wall from where the cloaked group stood. Whatever it was, it didn't feel right. But there was a much more pressing issue that was becoming visible. The golden glow of the barrier was dimming around the energy. Neither needed to say anything before they both shot into action. Jura had already leapt off the platform and swiped forward with one hand, a smaller pillar of earth shooting out of their previous ground and aimed right towards the cloaked group. His feet landed careful on its surface before it could shoot too far ahead of him, giving him the fastest mode of transport he had to get to the ground. He was still going to arrive there last though. He didn't even see her move past him, but he knew if he looked back he would find Yoriyuki gone. The goddess of Flash was a demon when it came to speed, and he knew she would have already reached the enemy and had time to exchange blows with them before he would finish arriving. The sight he was greeted to was not exactly off from his beliefs. But it was not what he expected either. Yuryuki was already locked in battle with one of the cloaked individuals, and despite her speed, fast enough that she was a blur to his eyes, she had yet to subdue her opponent. Whoever they were also fast, darting around the ground and sky as black lightning. For a moment the sight actually looked familiar too, like he had seen this before. He didn't have time to think on it, however, his attention being needed on those before him. There was quite a few of them, it seemed. He counted 6 if he didn't include the enemy Yuryuki had taken. Were they all strong? None of them really felt like they were. If anything, they felt weak, incredibly so. But then he could feel the same kind of thing coming from Yuryuki's opponent, an opponent who despite that reading was keeping up with her. There was no doubt in his mind that they were enemies though. An ally had no need to damage the barrier, and if they had been with Jushiro they would already have access to the barrier's controls to be allowed access through. Whether they were some kind of dark guild or organization that felt like they had better chances with the Hollows, for whatever reason, or had been bribed to do this, none of that was allowed to matter in his mind. Instead he jumped straight to action, his staff coming out from behind his back and extending to its full length. He let it spin for only 2 full rotations before he slammed the base straight into the ground, multiple pillars of earth rising from the ground around him, bending their shapes into sharper ends, before firing straight towards the 6 cloaked individuals. He heard a laugh, definitely female and for some reason familiar, as one of the smallest of the group stepped before his attacks. A slender arm came out from within the cloak, revealing in the process an arm as black as the void. A few movements of those fingers and letters began to form between the two of them, made of the same kind of energy that was behind her affecting the barrier. His attacks struck out, but a different word blocked each blow before he had a chance to read them. He had still expected one of his attacks to break through. Whatever magic she was using, it was obviously a form of letter magic of some kind, and he only knew of one mage with that kind of speed with words. But even her speed wouldn't chance the fact that a single word wouldn't be able to completely block all his attacks like this. Well, maybe it wasn't accurate to say his attacks had completely stopped. There was resistance, he could feel it, and he was sure in a few moments his power would overcome hers. But the fact his control over the earth he was manipulating was weakening was worrying, only fixed by pouring more magic into them. Oh? I'm this much stronger now with only a few words. That voice. No. He was imagining it. But being this close, he could make out more details that poked out from her hood. Like the small bit of blue hair he remembered seeing on another individual. His focus almost slipped, but he recovered in time to dodge the swing of the sword of another cloaked individual, the earth he rose up to buy him time being cut through with no effort at all on the part of the assailant. That couldn't be right though. His magic wasn't that weak. Hey Jerome. Out of my way. The one he assumed was Jerome leapt back away from him, revealing the woman who had stopped his attack before with now both arms revealed. Her other arm was just like the first, normal pale skin visible from the elbow up. It was a vast difference from her right hand, the dark coloring only lasting up a bit above her wrist. What worried him though was the staff she now had out in her left hand, the lacrima within pointed towards him as words formed in the air between him and her staff. No. It couldn't be. His eyes widened in shock as he realized he recognized the spell, words he had seen used before on occasion forming and shaping the path of the attack he knew was about to come. He wasn't treated to the name of it, but he didn't need to hear it, knowing what was coming. His free hand was already becoming a blur as he swiped out rapidly, barriers of earth shooting up as the first signs of flames appeared. They weren't the usual red he remembered, but they still traveled the same way, the black fire being funneled towards him by the wind that formed, keeping the blaze under control until it could reach its target. He thought the amount of barriers he had deployed had been overkill. But after seeing what that other man did with that sword, he had decided it was best to err on the side of caution. He realized immediately though that even that wasn't enough, the last of his earth barriers cracking and giving him mere moments to react before it would shatter. All he could do was slam his foot back against the earth, forcing the ground to rise beneath him as fast as possible. Not a moment later did the last of his defenses break under the force of the black flames, the vortex of fire slamming into the rising ground and almost tearing that down too. If there was one thing he could count as a success from that whole encounter though, it would be the fact the wind had blown back the woman's hood to finally give him a confirmation of what he had already feared. Levy. He would have recognized her anywhere. She was a member of Fairy Tale, a guild he had some good friends in, and he had seen her fight enough to know that this wasn't a mere imitation. This was the real deal. No, it was perhaps even better than that. Oops, he heard her say as she pulled her hood back up, sending what he assumed was an apologetic look at her companions. Looks like I got a bit carried away. It is fine, he heard of one of them say as he slowly lowered himself back to the ground on the remains of his platform. We have done what we needed to. It's time to leave. Really? I'd hoped we could have fought more considering you brought so many of us out here. Oh well. Turning back towards him, he saw Levy give him a wave. When she pulled her hood back a bit though, he was greeted by the mocking smile on her face rather than the kind one he might have seen on her in the past. Got to run, Jura. If you see Ichigo, not that I expect you to much, tell him I'm looking forward to seeing him again. I need to pay him back for these lovely scars he gave me. He had no idea what to make of that, nor of the energy rising from behind all the enemies. It gathered into one large mass beneath their feet, forming a massive shadow in the area they guarded, before he saw it. The shape of a giant right hand reaching out from the ground, its fingers wrapping around all six of them. The seventh shot towards it before Yoriyuki could stop him, landing in the self-made shadow just in time to be wrapped in the hand's grasp. None of them had intended to let them leave. But the moment his earth came into contact with the hand it broke, unable to overcome the energy before him. Yoriyuki was the same, her attacks not even denting the mass of energy as it tightened around those within its grasp. And then all seven were gone, the hand pulling them all down into the shadow and vanishing entirely. He felt himself staring at the impossible sight for a moment. Until the roars of thousands of hollows brought him right back to reality. The barrier came first. With a quick glance he could already tell how bad it was. It stretched up dozens of meters, and it was wide too. But the damage done didn't appear as bad as it could have been. The opening was small and even if hollows leaked through it would be easy to manage. But he'd rather they didn't have to worry about it for the time being. Stabbing his staff into the ground, he pressed his hands together as he willed the earth to move once more. Rather than worrying about speed, he made sure to take his time and raise the ground in front of the barrier. It had to be as thick as possible if he wanted to make it by any sort of reasonable time, ensuring it couldn't be broken through easily by the swarms of hollows likely incoming. You sure you never encountered a group like that before? Jura asked as Yoriyuki approached him, moving the last bit of earth in place and reinforcing it the best he could before separating his hands and picking up his staff from the ground he had implanted it in. That's certainly not your typical set of unknowns. If I had, I wouldn't be so in the dark on this, Yoriyuki muttered in annoyance. That guy, whoever he was practically playing with me. I was by far faster, but he was reacting fast enough to both keep me occupied with him and keep up with my movements. I even heard him say once that I was too slow compared to someone. Who the hell says that to me? He wasn't sure. But part of him feared he did. He had recognized those movements after all, and after the matter with Levy. He couldn't say it. Not at least until he could confront Ichigo himself about it. Levy was meant to be with him from what he remembered hearing, unless that changed. It would be worth checking in on Laxus with Fairy Tale just to be sure. Until he knew, he couldn't just make any old accusation about it to someone who didn't really know them. How long do you think that hole will remain sealed for? Yoriyuki asked him, gesturing at it with one hand before glancing at the state of the barrier around it. The energy that had been used on it still lingered oddly enough, the barrier's glow at those areas much weaker than anywhere else. Will the barrier be repaired first? It'll probably take a bit to be repaired, but the earth should hold for the work to start. After that it's just a matter of holding them back until it finishes. So long as nothing else goes wrong. He frowned, kneeling down against the earth and placing an ear against it. Jura. Something's wrong, he muttered up to her. I can feel something. Some kind of rumbling deep below the ground. A result of our new friends. I'm not sure, he admitted as he got back to his feet, turning his attention to where the enemies they had just fought had been standing. They had done something with the barrier, but was a hole like this all that they cared about? It was barely anything in the grand scheme of things. Had they driven them off? No. They hadn't done that at all. The enemy had chosen to leave, when they still had the upper hand, which meant they had achieved what they set out to do. But what was it? The damage above was barely anything. Unless... His mind fell into a panic as he quickly began to walk forward, that walk breaking into a run as he rushed towards the barrier's edge. He was thankful Yoryuki was patient enough to not ask him what was wrong right now, because he doubted he had the energy to speak with how he felt. With a single swipe, the earth covering the ground near the edge of the barrier dropped. It was just a small amount, a meter only, but it was enough for him to see below the ground. From what he had been told, the barrier encircled everything. It might appear like a dome on the surface, but in reality it was a sphere. Which made the sight before him more worrying than anything when he found no sign of the golden edge of the barrier, instead the lingering energy left behind by whatever magic that group had used. How far down? Yoryuki asked him, already catching on from just one look at it. Could they have done much? He thought back. Out of all 7, only 3 had stepped forward to fight. What had the others been doing? He had seen it, out of the corner of his eye, but what was it? He remembered. They had been gathered around the same spot, focusing on that energy they had produced. At least that was what it had looked like. Except he was sure that the energy was being directed downwards into the earth rather than upwards. The damage on the surface was a side effect, he muttered in realization. It must have spilt over. Their real objective was to weaken the barrier below us. The ground shook as Yoryuki opened her mouth, both stumbling as they tried to keep their footing. Well, that makes this question more pressing. What was that? I don't know, Jura admitted worriedly. He could feel that same rumbling under the ground through his magic more now. It was getting closer. Rapidly so even. Something's happening below us. Did they trigger an earthquake? The ground shook again and Yoryuki grabbed onto Jura for support this time. The process had her gaze ending up looking out through the barrier's edge, seeing the feet of the Minos Grande in the distance as they continued to fire Ceros. Blocking our sight. This timing with the barrier. The ground rumbling. She pushed herself off Jura as her thoughts came to a realization, her head snapping towards their forces. Oh God. That's got to be what they're doing. Yoryuki. We need to hurry. Our troops need to evacuate before her words drew to an end as she realized her thoughts had come too late, massive chunks of earth being forced up in the center of their forces and slamming back towards the ground. Signs of magic lit up around the army to deflect or even shatter the earth, but that wasn't the real threat. It was the sound of roars as the first sign of a hollow began to emerge from the massive hole in the ground. Neither of the two could see the hollow, but the sound and the energy was enough to alert them to the threat before them. Some people had compared the barrier to a cage in the past. Never had they felt that those words fitted so well with their situation. Because of that, it left them with one simply realization. They had nowhere to run to now that the hollows were in. Protector of the fairies. This world is cruel, so I'll destroy it. Fire. There was so much fire. The mere sight filled him with fear, as it would anyone. And the beasts above in the sky didn't make such a scene any better. A large dragon, with scales as red as flames, was clashing with a dragon of pure savagery, armored to the teeth with spikes and oversized plates along its body. Compared to the fire-breathing dragon, this one had to be 3 times larger and was throwing around enough force with its roars that it was causing shockwaves felt even at this distance. Despite that, the smaller dragon was still holding its own, its deadly flames burning through the scales that protected the other dragon and roasting away any flesh it could touch. His travels allowed him the chance to see dragons before, but he had never seen 2 this powerful, nor had he seen them clash on such a scale. But they lived up to all the fear-filled tales he had been told on his journey, of beasts capable of altering the very battlefield with but a single roar. Beasts with scales so hard that even the strongest of swords might chip against their surfaces. Beasts with magical power so large that it was enough to cause most to suffocate from the pressure they would exert fighting at full strength. Even now he could feel their power, beating like a drum to his senses. It threatened to drown his own mind from the pressure, and he was sure many would have already given in to terror under such a feeling. But the fear he felt right now was not for his own sake. It had been a long time since he felt fear for himself, because even if they could hurt him, they would not kill him. But they could others. He wasn't sure when he had started running again. Perhaps he had never stopped, his mind too distracted to keep up with his body's movements. But it didn't matter. He had to make it to the village quickly. His brother was waiting for him, on the verge of death, and not even these dragons could prevent him from making it to him. The closer he got, the more the dangers began to present themselves. The lush forest that surrounded the village was burning, the flames having already consumed half of the vegetation in the area. He didn't know how long it would take to recover if he took too much damage from them, but by the time he had a chance to consider the other possibilities, he had already thrown himself into the inferno. It was foolish. Idiotic even. He could feel his flesh being stripped away, the flames far hotter than normal fire. Being burnt alive on that pyre was nothing compared to this. What might have taken a minute was happening in seconds, and yet he kept pushing on. This was the quickest way to his brother, so there had been no other choice but to brave the danger. "Don't stop!" he screamed out, his voice raw from the pain the flames were causing him. He felt his body slow down for a second as his leg gave away before he fell into a safe spot, the flames lighter in the small area. That was all the space he needed, what had burnt beginning to heal up so fast that it might as well have never been there. He was lucky he healed so fast, because he had already thrown himself back into the full brunt of the inferno before even checking. He hated his power. He caused nothing but death, and in the end even death rejected him. He was bound to a cursed life, unable to die no matter how much was thrown at him. But right now he didn't care. For once in his life, this power was a gift. One that enabled him to go further than ever before, to finally save someone that actually mattered. "Don't stop," he muttered through his wrecked voice, the flames tearing him apart once again. "Keep going. Faster. Quicker." It was not feeling. It was like his own curse was responding to his will. The more he wished for it, the more it tried to keep up with his desires. Even pause lasted even less, his body healing up faster and faster until he was sure such someone might miss the sight of his body healing if they blinked. The flames became nothing but nuisances by the end. Even a single moment was enough for him to return to full health, and by the time he broke free from the forest's edge he was back to the same state as when he had first entered it. He couldn't rest yet though. All he had done was clear one danger. The dragons were still fighting, only their battle had left the sky and ended up on the ground. He could see the larger dragon had both of its wings missing good chunks of their flesh, black edges where the flames must have burnt them away to. The smaller dragon, however, was missing a wing entirely, and he could even see that wing lying near the village edge from where it must have fallen to. His eyes drifted away from them as he ran, darting through a back alley that would take him towards where he needed to go. He knew this town like the back of his hand, no matter how many years had passed, and avoiding the eyes of the dragons and reaching his destination was more than doable for someone like him. A body finally greeted him as he broke out back into a main street. He recognized the man. Why wouldn't he when he had killed the man's daughter? Unfortunately he didn't even have time to pity him. He was past the man without a second thought, discarding anything in his mind that might have distracted him from his goal. More bodies were beginning to greet him the closer he got. Entire streets were destroyed, with lone houses standing in half-made states. Some houses had been burnt to the ground, nothing left but molten remains of the house and any who lived in it. He discarded any thoughts of care for them to prevent him from halting. Other houses looked like they had been hit from above by a great force. He could see arms and other limbs poking out of rubble out of the corner of his eyes. He ignored them and kept running, doing his best to keep out of the focus of the dragons. He doubted they would pay much focus to him with the other in front of them, but he'd rather not take the chance and test how well his curse worked with the dragon's digestive system. Finally he found it, appearing near the end of the path he had just arrived at. Compared to the main area of the village, the houses were a bit more spread out here, and it must have saved them from the same fate. Houses were still in bad states, but the damage was nothing compared to the previous display. Some houses were burnt half away, others half demolished, but their frames still remained recognizable. And though some kind of miracle, one of those still in good condition was the one he was trying to reach. The front of the house had been brought down, what looked like a large scale that could have been ripped from the larger dragon embedded in the ground before it in the midst of the rubble. The source of the destruction he hazarded to guess it, but such ideas had already been thrown away the moment he passed it. It wasn't important. Nothing was right now but one thing. Downstairs was no good. He checked every room but he couldn't find a single sign of the house's occupants. But they had been there recently. The scattered drawers and mess in each room showed that they must have cleared out quickly and tried to escape. Maybe they had succeeded, but he threw away any thoughts that cared if they did or not. They weren't important. His feet took the stairs two at a time, reaching up to the landing above and glancing around. He could see the dragons in the distance, their battle getting closer with the two lost in their primal urges. But he turned away quickly when he couldn't find doors or passages to any room of importance. Instead he checked the last two he could find. The first was a bathroom, entirely useless to him. And so he rushed to the other, pulling the door off its already loose hinges and avoiding the shower of rubble from above that fell as a result. The damage was gone in a heartbeat, his hands gripping the doorway's edge and forcing his way through. There was a hole in the roof, one he hadn't seen before when he was approaching the house, but that observation was discarded for more important information. A hand came up to his eyes as he tried to wipe away the dust that had fallen on him, helping him to focus on the room itself. A bedroom, one that looked like it had been attended to quite frequently, and with the sole occupant still present. He was before the bed before he even realized, staring down at the one person he had desperately thrown himself through danger for in order to see again. For a brief moment he let a smile appear on his face. He had made it. All those years traveling, the failed attempts of finding the magic needed until finally he reached that man, the ring forged that would allow him to finally harness his power over death for something good, it was all going to be worth it for this moment. But something was wrong. Why wasn't his brother breathing? Why wasn't he struggling with pain? His brother was meant to be ill. Dying in fact. So why did he look so peaceful? Was it some kind of medication that he didn't know about? Was it suppressing the symptoms? Was it keeping his brother in some kind of dreamlike state? He had heard of medicine capable of doing that, but it was rare from what he had heard. And definitely not procurable in a place like this. He could see something though. He knew what was wrong. In fact, it was right before his eyes. And yet his mind wouldn't let him focus on it. Rather, they couldn't let him focus on it. Everything that was sane in him was telling him to leave now, despite everything he had gone through to get here. To run as far away as possible before it was too late. So he threw those thoughts away. All that mattered was his brother. He had to heal him now. His hand came up, the black ring crafted for him on his finger ready, and white light began to engulf his entire hand. His magic brought only death. That was an unavoidable fact. But death itself was merely a part of life. They were opposites. What is born must always die. What is healed will eventually crumble away in the end once again. They were opposites, but that was this ring's purpose. Because they were opposites, because they were connected so intrinsically, because he could understand exactly what such things meant and the nature that they embodied, he could do this. What was magic only meant to kill instead became magic meant to save, to heal, and give life back to whoever it touched. Holding it out over his brother's chest, he poured everything he could into it. Not just his magic but his will, his heart, and even his soul. This had to work. It had to. All those years traveling, running around searching for a solution, had finally brought him to this. Nothing else he knew of would work as well as this could. He had tested it countless times, on what had been random strangers. Some of them he had found like that and he had helped them for his own practice with the ring. Others he had purposefully harmed, all for the sake of testing the ring's limits so he would be confident in its usage when he finally made it back home. He doubted his brother would approve of his actions, but he would rather face such disapproval than not hear it at all. But no matter how much the light spread, no matter how much he tried, there was still no response. His brother's small body stayed as still as it had been from the moment he had walked into the room. His chest didn't even beat. Why? Why wasn't it working? His hand moved slightly, trying a different place, when he felt it brush against something wet. The energy deactivating, his hand slowly came back only for him to stare at an odd red liquid. It wasn't his. He could bleed but never for very long nowadays, and certainly not long enough to cover his hand in the stuff like this. Whose was it? And why hadn't he noticed it before? His eyes slowly drifted to the source, even as his mind screamed at him not to. He had been trying to ignore it, desperately even, but his eyes eventually settled on the area his mind had tried to prevent him from looking. That was the doctor, right? Why was he hunched over his brother's body like that? Why was he still here in fact? He hadn't said a word since he showed up, and there was no way someone could sleep through that mess. So why? His eyes drifted down to his hand and then back to the doctor. Blood. This was the man's blood. His eyes slowly began to focus on the large beam that was actually pinning the man down. Why hadn't he noticed the fact the man was trapped like this over his brother's body? Why hadn't he noticed that the man was dead? Oh. He knew why. Because this wasn't just the doctor's blood, was it? His mind was trying to stop him but his body wouldn't respond, using his limited strength to clear the rubble that trapped the man in place. He should have cared about the man, especially for what he had done for his brother's sake and how he had tried to shield him from the rebel, but he still discarded such thoughts. They weren't important right now. Only his brother was. With the last piece of rubble pinning the doctor down, he pulled the man free and let him fall backwards with a piece of the rubble still sticking through the man's chest. There was still blood over his brother's sheets, over where his stomach should be. There was a hole too, but he ignored it. Instead, the white light of life magic returned to his hand and he held it over the wound he could see. The sheets continued to get in the way, so he discarded them without a second thought. All that mattered was fixing his brother's injuries. Flesh was slowly reknitted, blood restored, and organs repaired. Healing the body was so easy to do he could have done it with his eyes closed. And yet still his brother didn't move. Why? Why wasn't he moving? He was healed now. He should be filled with energy? So why wasn't he moving? He discarded such thoughts, carefully grabbing his brother and pulling him onto his back. He'd think about it later. They had to get out of here first. There was nothing worth saving from this town, nothing worth remembering, so he could leave now with his brother. The dragons were still out there, but if they were careful they'd be fine. If he slipped out away from them and left the village that way, he could even hide it out for a few days and wait for things to calm down. That would work for sure. Right? The doubt was cast from his mind as he carefully headed for the stairs, being more patient this time with his speed. His brother had to be protected. Even if it meant being slower, it was better to do that than to cause his brother any more pain. The sound of a roar almost deafened him, causing him to fall to his knees in pain as he desperately tried to keep his grip on his brother. The dragons were close. Dangerously close. The moment he could, he got a peek out of the doorway, the two dragons facing down across the only way out he had. He didn't have the strength to break open another way out, nor could he just afford to wait it out in case this house got caught up as collateral damage. He had to run. So he did, moving his brother from his back to his arms and sprinting as fast as he could while clinging to his brother. If the dragons noticed him, they didn't acknowledge him, too busy locked on each other as they lunged once more. A set of claws, wrapped with flames, was being raised, but the bigger danger was the massive clawed arm of the larger dragon. He wasn't the target, he was just merely in the way of the swing, and as such the arm slammed straight into his back and sent him flying. He barely had enough sense to try and roll over in the air, his back slamming against a lone standing wall of a recently destroyed house and causing both to shatter. His brother slipped from his grasp as he tumbled further across the ground, a scream of pain involuntarily escaping his lips. That didn't matter though. He was healed the moment after his body had left that wall. Picking himself up from the ground, he began to push his way through the rubble of the destroyed building to reclaim his brother once again. Oh? Well, isn't that rare? You're still alive. Was that the dragon's voice? His eyes drifted towards the source for a moment to see the larger of the two dragons looking at him. Part of its face had been burnt away, one eye gone with large scars running across it that were still bleeding, but it appeared this fight finally had a winner. The other dragon was lying on the ground, struggling to stand with a pool of blood beginning to surround its body. From what he could see too, there were large claw marks across its throat. Both were ignored, however. All that mattered was his brother. He continued to push on, unafraid of whatever the dragon might try and do to him. His eyes could only see his brother before him, forcing him on further until he was about to reach out to him and grab him. Huh? What on earth are you carrying about dead weight for? He ignored it. Carefully lifting his brother back into his arms protectively, only then did he spare a glance at the dragon. It was looking at him oddly. No, it was more like it was amused at something. But what was it? Regardless, he had other matters to consider. Like making sure he could get his brother safe somewhere and... Oh? How amusing, the dragon said, its words cutting off his thoughts and forcing him to focus on them. It was almost like the dragon was getting a sense of glee from this. You humans are always so fun to watch in disasters like this. Clinging to what you believe will help give you hope. Grasping what little normality you can find from before my arrival in order to keep yourselves sane. I do enjoy seeing your lot struggle in your foolishness. Ignore it. His mind wouldn't stop screaming those words at him. Ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it. Is he someone important to you? He must be if you're climbing through his mess of a village with him. Is he a friend? No, got to be more important than that. A brother maybe? I've seen that kind of love before in others who have tried to do the same as you. The dragon's amusement seemed to grow the more he spoke. He was sure his face was revealing nothing but his body and mind weren't quite in sync right now. You have realized it, haven't you? Are you ignoring it? Ignore it. Ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, ignore it, ignore. He's dead. His mind crumbled to a halt. What laughter he heard from the dragon was lost to him, his eyes only able to focus on his brother in his arms. Why did his brother still stay so still? Why hadn't he moved at all? Even with medication, there was no way he should have been this still. And there was other things too. Like why did his brother feel so cold in his hands? Where was the warmth he always felt from his brother's skin? Memories of the hugs he had been given having remained in his mind as a source of strength for years. Why had there been so much blood when he found his brother, not all of it the doctor's? Why had he been unable to see any of it? Ah! He knew why. Because his brother was dead. He felt a weight slip from his arms as the realization kicked in, his mind slowly piecing together what he had been ignoring. The way he had tried to ignore what was in his sight, the way he had tried to make excuses or reasons for what he saw, it all made sense. He had known from the moment he had entered that room, hadn't he? But he hadn't wanted to accept it. So he had ignored everything that tried to tell him otherwise just to hang on a bit longer in intentional ignorance. But he couldn't ignore it now. What he had been trying to ignore, what he had been trying to pretend wasn't truth, it was all clear to him now. No matter how much he tried to reject it, no matter how much he tried to cast away those thoughts, the same conclusion still remained. His brother was dead. He didn't know what caused it. Had it been the falling debris the doctor had tried to stop? Had it been the illness itself, him having arrived too late to save him? In the end, none of it mattered. The ring he had was powerful, it could do a lot of things. It was meant to be the tool to finally save his brother. But right now, all it felt like was iron lead. Could he have prevented this if he had made it back faster? He had rushed from city to city and only really paused in each whenever he found something that looked promising. The longest he had delayed was when testing the ring's abilities, and even that had only been minor distractions to help ensure his mastery of the ring was at the necessary level for healing. How much had he already thrown away too for his brother's sake? How many dead bodies had he ignored, without even checking for life, as he walked through the village? How many people had he killed while in the wild in order to pursue his goals of saving his brother's life? How many things had he already given up for this result? It all came to nothing. Everything he had given up, everything he had sacrificed, it all came to nothing. Hadn't he been happy earlier that his curse had benefited him for once? Why had he ever expected anything good would have happened? From the moment he was born, he had been an unwanted existence who only brought dead. Not even his brother, the most precious being in the world to him, had been spared from his cursed existence. He should have died. He would rather have died than for his brother to have suffered. But he felt like he finally understood now. This world, it wasn't kind. Not to him at least. Everything he touched would have its life robbed from it, so why was he trying to still run away from that? He had spent so much time trying to gain the power opposite to himself when in reality he should have never have turned away from the only path that had ever been laid before him. "You're really not going to say anything?" the dragon asked in disappointment. "Here I was hoping for dash." Silence. He didn't raise his voice much, nor did he try to sound particularly threatening. But the dragon froze all the same. He would have found it amusing if not for the pain he felt. That a beast as large and as strong as this had been silenced by the words of a boy not even a fraction of the dragon's age. The dragon didn't stay quiet for long. He heard it roar something, the words too deafening to his ears, before a large claw stabbed forward and slammed straight through his stomach. The claw was almost as wide as his entire chest, and he was sure the pain would have been excruciating. But he couldn't feel it. However much it hurt, it was nothing more than a dull flame to the pain he felt inside. His eyes looked up, away from his brother's body, before staring back defiantly at the dragon who believed him dead. He knew it was surprised to see him moving like this. There was no longer any fear of pain here, nor of anything this dragon could do. He understood what the world sought from him now. This was the true nature of his curse. He was not allowed to die, because for whatever reason the world wasn't done making him suffer yet. But if that was the case, then why did he have to cling to the moral high ground when no one had ever appreciated him doing? The people of his world had always wanted him to suffer, just because of a curse he had never asked for. So why should he be pursuing a path that all of them rejected? They wanted a monster. No, they wanted a demon. So why shouldn't he be one? The energy of his ring lit up once more, only this time the light was as pitch black as night. He could feel it here. This was the energy that always coursed through his body, the energy that he had always detested. But now, all he saw was a weapon. It didn't matter if the beast before him was a dragon from the stories he had heard and not some random human he had met. In the end, all things met the same fate. They would die. So he'd help this pathetic beast get there a little faster. His other hand reached out and grabbed the claw, pulling his body further forward and ignoring whatever pain it sent through his body. The dragon didn't make a move. It hadn't since he started glaring at it. Whether it was out of shock or fear, he didn't care. Such thoughts didn't matter. Instead he just pulled himself closer until he was at the end of the claw where it met flesh. His other hand rose up, the energy around it growing larger, before he slammed it straight against the flesh. He doubted the dragon even understood what he had been doing. Even with its scales damaged and missing in areas like the place he hit, its flesh was still strong. But that meant nothing to his magic. It didn't care for how powerful a body this beast had. It could have caused hundreds of blades to shatter against it and it wouldn't have mattered in the slightest. Because in the end, his magic still penetrated the flesh like it was water. It didn't take long. If anything, he wished it had taken longer. But regardless of his wishes, the dragon simply fell to the ground it had been standing on and remained still. He continued to watch it, what little life that remained in its eyes being dulled until nothing remained. But it still wasn't enough. He still hurt. Pulling his body free from the claw, uncaring about how he worsened the injury as he did so, he stumbled for a second before catching his footing. He didn't even need to glance down to know that his body was in perfect condition once again. His feet slowly began to take him towards the other dragon, his body moving before his brain even realized what he was doing. Within a few moments he was before the smaller of the two dragons, unsure of what expression he was showing on his face right now. A human. "What are you doing here?" The dragon seemed to be struggling to speak, blood still leaking out from the wound on its throat. It was probably the dragon's own strong constitution that had kept it alive for so long. "Why didn't you run?" Awadesh, he didn't even let it finish, his right hand coming to rest on the dragon's head and making it pause. He could have healed it so easily. With but a single command, white light could have shone on his finger and saved this creature. He didn't know why these two dragons had fought. Maybe they had been fighting over territory. Maybe it had been over food or treasure. Maybe it had even been a matter of morals. He had heard some dragons didn't like killing humans, so for all he knew this could have been one of them, trying to fend off the other more obviously hostile dragon. It would only take a moment to ask, to find out the answer. But he didn't care. It didn't matter whether this dragon had good intentions or not. In his eyes, it only needed one thing right now. The black energy of death shone once again on his hand and blasted straight into the dragon's face. He let it grow, the energy consuming the dragon's entire head and searching for any way into its body. Whether it found a chink through the cracks, whether it got in through the wounds, or even if it got in through choking the dragon, he didn't care which method worked. So long as the beast died. It did. He hadn't even doubted that it would work. But the pain was still there. This wasn't enough. He wanted this pain to stop. He wanted it to stop so badly. His eyes began to scan the area around him, uncaring whether the life he might find was human or not. But there was nothing. Nothing nearby at least. He could see it in the distance. The small sign of smoke, from a direction he knew far too well. For some God knows reason the damage from the dragons hadn't spread that far out over there, and that thought only made him hate the beasts more. But that hatred was dulled by another hatred, one far stronger than the one he felt for the beasts. His feet took him towards his goal without any need for prompting. He knew where he was going. He knew exactly where he needed to be. He barely noticed the time go by as he traversed the same journey he had done 1,000 times before. By the time he reached there, the sun was already beginning to set, the light of the distant flames in the forest much dimmer now that their fuel supply was running low. But his focus was quickly stolen away by the laughter he heard from inside, the same laughter he had always heard from the two in this house when they were drunk. Why had this house been spared? He didn't care that it was far away from the village. Why had this place been spared? This world would ensure his brother dies and yet let these two live? This world was nothing more than a sick joke, one he wouldn't mind ending himself if he was being honest. With a slow push he opened up the doorway to the house he had been in for most of his life. He would hardly call this home. Home had been whenever his brother was. This was nothing more than a building, one that he had no fond memories of outside of his interactions with his brother. He walked past the trash that had piled up in the hallway, the state of the place having fallen to ruins without him to keep it in any sort of order. Broken glass dug into his feet. Was it from the window or from some random junk the two here had stolen? It didn't matter. The glass was pushed out as he walked, and the only blood left behind was on the glass itself. Finally he was standing there, in the doorway to an open room. The furniture was smashed to bits, what was once a large table broken in 3 areas with booze scattered all over the place. Was that puke in the corner too? He wouldn't disregard the possibility. Hey. He heard the man slur out a greeting, drawing his attention back towards him. Yuri. Who are you? This was the man meant to be his father? He had been gone only a few years, had been an object of the man's hatred and abuse ever since he was born, and yet right now the man couldn't even recognize him? Oh. The woman spoke, almost trying to sing her words out to some hum only she knew. It SSSSZE. Zer. Zeref. So you remember my name, he said to the woman meant to be his mother. I'm surprised. I didn't think you even knew it. Hey. The man snarled, but whatever anger he was trying to show had its impact massively lessened by the fact he couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet without shaking from side to side. You, Res, pecked your moth air. You hear me, boy? Did you even notice? Why was he even asking this question? He knew the answer. But he had to know. Did you even notice when I left? When my brother left? Or did you forget and go off stealing and drinking for all that time? Brother. Ah. Why did he go? The man paused for a moment, even looking confused as he shared a glance with his wife. That lasted for only a few seconds before they both broke out laughing, grabbing another bottle of whatever booze they had stolen recently and downing it as quickly as they could. I should have known. What was I expecting from you two but this? Hey. Don't talk to us that way. The woman he refused to acknowledge as his mother threw the bottle she had at him, the glass it was made out of, shattering against his face and causing her and her husband to laugh. That was, at least, until the glass pushed itself from his flesh and revealed unmarked skin beneath it. It was that action that finally made them show a different expression. Disgust. "I see you remember my curse," he said to them, taking a step forward. They still stared back at him with those same looks on their face, the same disgusted expressions that they had always shown him the moment his power showed itself, and he felt his anger grow as a result. "I have to ask. Did you even show any compassion to me when I was born? Or had you already decided on the kind of existence you wanted for me? I'm pretty sure that I stepped on you as quickly as I could," the man said to him. It was such a pain when your head grew back. A pain. But he was so easy to care for. The woman tried to give him a smile, but her disgust still remained on her face. Didn't have to do anything. A free helper. With no strings attached. "I understand." He closed his eyes for a moment. He had needed to hear those words. So when he opened his eyes once more, they showed nothing but apathetic and detached emotions towards them. "I had been worried. Worried that you might have had the slightest bit of good in you. But I should thank you at least. You helped confirm to me exactly what kind of world this is." Yes, he knew it now. Nothing was fair in this world. People like this could be allowed to exist and would cause nothing but pain and suffering to those their lives touch. Why had people like this been allowed to live when others hadn't been? When his brother hadn't been? He had been afraid that there might have been some redeeming factor in them that had justified it all, but in the end the world was simply cruel and unfair. Not that this had changed anything with what he planned to do here. From the moment he had approached this house, he had intended to do one thing. With one hand he slowly pulled the ring from his finger. He didn't need it right now. He didn't want focus or control. He just wanted what was already there, in its raw and uncontrolled state. It flowed to the surface. He had spent years trying to control it, to keep it suppressed, but today he was more than happy to guide it out. Flickers of dark light had already appeared in the world around him, and it seemed the two before him had finally realized the danger he presented to them right now. The man grabbed for a rusted knife nearby on the ground while his mother began to raise her hand, small bits of wind beginning to form in her palm that would slip through her grasp every few seconds. Pathetic. Both of them. Such beings only deserved one thing. Death. So he'd bring it to them. With a single step forward, the energy exploded from his body, surrounding him in a protective embrace and expanding out all around him. Like the dragons, they fell to the floor with barely a word. He watched them fall, wondering if it would make him feel any better. But it didn't. The rage was still there, deafening to his mind and threatening to overwhelm everything. He couldn't stand being in this place any longer, so he left, heading back down the way he had come towards the village once more. It was pitch black by the time he reached the village. With his ring back on his finger, he let the life aspect of its power shine to guide his path, finding little use for it anymore but as a glorified torch. His feet carried him down the same roads as before until the bodies of the two dragons came into view once more. He passed them without a second glance, coming to a stop right before the body of his brother. He couldn't bear to look at him as he fell to his knees, slowly grabbing his brother's body and cradling him in his arms. The rage he felt slowly gave way to pain once again, tears finally falling as he clung to his brother for dear life. "I'm sorry," he whispered, unable to stop himself from repeating the words again as he looked down at the boy with pink hair in his arms. "I'm sorry, Natsu. I failed. But don't worry. I can still save you. This world is what killed you. What made us suffer. So I'll destroy it first, and then we'll finally be able to escape this place. So just hang on a bit longer, alright? One day I'll save you for sure. Your brother wouldn't lie to you after all, right?" An odd emotion flashed through his mind. What was that? Had he heard something? It sounded like Ichigo. His eyes snapped open, and Ichigo found himself facing Nozomi only a few inches away from him. She looked at him oddly for a moment, tilting her head curiously before asking, "Are you okay?" He nodded, unable to trust his own voice at the moment. He could feel something wet on his face though, and it took a moment for him to realize what it was and raise a hand towards it. He was crying. Taking a moment to collect himself, to break away from the latest and most painful of Zeref's memories, he finally found the words to speak again. What's wrong? Is there trouble? Time to rest like this wasn't always very frequent, but this was far shorter than he had expected to be able to rest for. Which meant if he was being disturbed now, then it meant bad news for them all. And that meant dealing with what he had just learned could wait. It's the northern battlefield, Nozomi said softly, a spark of worry appearing in her eyes as she spoke. They've been overrun. Protector of the fairies. Disaster in the north. Walking through the lines of scattered soldiers, Ichigo did his best to ignore the sight around him. He wasn't entirely successful, the moans and cries of pain visible no matter how many he tried to block out. The place was a disaster zone. He didn't know how many had died yet, nor how many were even here. But even at a glance it was obvious that this was a mere fraction of their original force. Ichigo. Over here. Hearing the voice, Ichigo altered his path towards the man calling out to him. Jura stood there in greeting at the edge of the army, the closest person to the newly constructed earth wall. The sheer size of it had been the first thing to grab his attention the moment he arrived here. It stretched all the way up to the top of the barrier and extended round in a long arc towards the edges of the barrier. Even at a glance it had been enough for him to know what it was meant to be. A cage for the enemy. Reaching Jura, he found himself unsure of what to even say to begin with. What was he meant to say in a time like this? All he heard was that the north battlefield had been overrun and he had had Nozomi take him there immediately before he had been able to think about anything else. She had left him for the time being to go gather the others, to bring any reinforcements necessary and any help needed for the wounded, but that also left him seriously in the dark on the actual events here. So in the end, he settled for the only thing he could say. I'm glad to see you're still alive, he said honestly. I haven't heard much of what happened here. Mind filling me in? That would be you to rush here that quickly, Jura muttered as he turned towards the wall, gesturing Ichigo to follow him as they walked. Something happened at the barrier. An odd group appeared and did something. I've got no idea what but dash. Hold on. Ichigo raised a hand in emphasis before turning to the girl hanging from his shoulder. You sense that, right? Mavis nodded, one hand held over her nose in a dramatic fashion. That stench is practically overpowering. I did feel something briefly earlier, but I wasn't sure at the time, so I was going to bring it up after we dealt with this. I hadn't anticipated that they were linked. You can both sense that energy? Jura asked in confusion. Some of it was lingering, but the foulness Yoryuki and I sensed has already vanished for me now. I figured the energy had simply run out, but maybe not, it seems. It might not be doing much, Ichigo admitted, but it likes to linger. It's called magical barrier particles. True anti-magic, which makes it very dangerous. It's also an unnatural power, which is why you would have reacted to its presence so strongly. But for you to even sense it in the first place means there was a lot of it being used. Frowning, he lowered his voice before muttering, what on earth was it even doing here anyway? I believe it was being used to weaken the barrier below the earth. We didn't see anything on the surface, bearing a smallish opening, but the energy seemed to have been poured down deep into the ground and eroded it away there. After that the hollows moved in. I don't know how they did it, but they burrowed underneath and came out from beneath our army very quickly afterwards. It's likely they had been waiting for this moment for a long time now. Pausing for a moment, he asked the question that had been bothering him for a while now. Was that group working for them? I didn't recognize their markings, and neither did Yoryuki. They weren't on our side at least, but neither could we identify who they were with. They're a group called Avatar. It's not exactly public knowledge, and even we only heard about them a month ago. We'd rather people not know about a power capable of neutralizing any and all kinds of magic. Not just because of the fear it would bring, but because of the people who might be inclined to seek it out. I'm more than happy to agree with you there, Jura stated. I fought one of them. She was skilled, but her magical power was extremely low. But despite that, she was able to halt my attacks and penetrate my defenses with ease. I do not mean to boast about my strength, but I am confident in my power, and yet she overcome it quite easily. If the wrong person got that power, like this group has, there is no doubt in my mind that they would abuse it and that they would be extremely difficult to stop. Well, I'm glad to hear you agree with me at least. As for who they are working with, I'm honestly not sure. Maybe Baragan got their assistance, but if they could make the tunnel they made that quickly, then why did they wait till now? Maybe Baragan has something in the background we don't know about, but honestly I think it's more likely he's been waiting for this plan to actually reach completion. The way Avatar has seemed to pop up so far makes us believe they are more of lone group, providing assistance or interference whenever their objectives align with those of others. And today they found that having the barrier breached would suit their goals. Ichigo shrugged. Last time we encountered them they wanted to observe Zeref's base being destroyed and even clashed with Natsu. Their goals aren't known to us, so we're just as in the dark as you. Whatever they did today, it merely provided Baragan with the incentive to attack now, I think. If they hadn't done anything, he would have likely done something different or would have already had a method to break through the barrier. It's strong, but others have done so, and he might have been willing to wait this long to make a move in order to gather the information he needed to do so. If you believe that is the case, I will have to trust that for now until we hear more. Reaching the wall, Jura slowly knelt to the ground and pressed his hand against the surface. Everything all right? Should be. I'm just checking. Yep, it's still trying. Ichigo's eyes narrowed as he looked at the spot Jura was covering with his hand. What's still trying? A hollow. A particularly pesky one at that. It's what I think made the tunnel, not that it can do so here. I'm continuously reinforcing the ground beneath us to keep it out for the time being. That has got to be using up a lot of magical power, Mavis pointed out as she looked up at the wall. And I doubt this was an easy job to do too. How long will you be able to last? Right now. Juro let out a weak laugh as he rose back up. I'm hoping I can last another hour, but if the hollow starts trying to pick up its attacks rather than testing the ground so much, or if the hollows behind the barrier start using zeros en masse, I doubt I'll be able to maintain it for even a third of that time. Making this barrier to delay them used up a lot. You won't be able to use your legendary spell at all, will you? Jura shook his head in response. Damn. This is good work, and looking at the state of everyone back there, it was definitely needed. But I know. Against such odds, my legendary spell would have been a key element in holding them back. Exactly. Just having it out there would have drawn a lot of attention, and we could have used that. Pausing for a moment, Ichigo tapped the rock a few times before pointing upwards. Can you open up a hole above? I'd like to have a look in at the state of things if you don't mind. That was why I brought you here. Jura said before tapping the ground with his foot. Slowly the ground beneath them began to rise, lifting them both up towards the top of the barrier itself. Hopefully I should be able to fill you in on everything that has happened since the hollows broke through, he added as the earth rose. You must be curious on our forces. I was curious. How many died? I don't know. It's more accurate to ask how many we've lost, Jura said to correct him, the earth reaching a suitable height for them before he placed his hand against the rock before them. With a single thought, a hole slowly began to emerge, allowing them passage through the barrier until they reached the other side to see the sight before them. Oh. Things changed quickly. The entire space, enclosed by the rock barrier and fairy sphere, had been covered in a layer of sand. Jura's expression to the sight said it. It hadn't been there when the fight started, and the fact there was some kind of giant made of sand in the distance didn't fill either with confidence either. I think I recognize that creature, Jura said as he glanced at it nervously. I saw it a few times outside the barrier, occasionally appearing to strike the shield and always being beaten back by our own forces. But it never seemed to die, rather it would be scattered or retreat whenever we did bring something that might threaten it. Physical attacks didn't even seem to affect it from what I remember. Hey Jura, you said you didn't know how many were lost, not killed, right? Jura turned to Ichigo only to see his gaze locked on the hollows fighting large groups in scattered areas. Exactly what did you mean by that? Exactly that, Jura muttered in shame, looking out himself at the small packets of resistance made of humans still fighting. Every so often they would see flashes of lightning tear around the battlefield, faster than the normal I could track, and large-scale magic was still being used. But the number of hollows vastly outnumbered whatever resistance there was. I was forced to make a call looking at the situation. You had to abandon them, muttered Mavis, dropping from Ichigo's shoulder to stand on the ground beside them and peer closer to the chaos. You said the hollows sprung up under the army, right? How much chaos did that cause? Too much, Jura whispered quietly. Yuryuki and I tried, but the hollows barely gave us time to try and fall back to regroup. I did my best to get out orders, to send signs and pass on the message, but I don't know how successful that was. Our command chain was shattered too quickly to react to, and no one was too sure on what to do but to fight and survive. I tried to cave in the tunnel to block the stem of hollows, but it was broken through once again each time I tried. Did anyone else try? Jura nodded. I saw Kagura from Mermaid Heel lead an assault, with what looked like the rest of her guild, down there as I gave an order for a full retreat. We never heard back from her, and no one has seen any member of her guild since. She's probably dead. They all probably are. I wouldn't be so sure, Mavis stated, her eyes rapidly darting from one side of the battlefield to the other. I'm not counting any increase in the hollow numbers. They're decreasing, in fact. Not quickly, mind you, but there is no influx of hollows entering the area. You mean they're still alive? Maybe. I'd be cautious on saying yes outright, but it's possible they are still holding the tunnel entrance. Look. Raising a hand, she pointed towards the giant hole the hollows had originally streamed out from. I assume that is where they all came from, right? Look at the hollows there. Some of them are actually entering the hole. Jura frowned for a moment, taking in the sight before his eyes widened in shock. They are. Which means they could still be down there fighting if the hollows are actively going back to try and clear them out. I'm not sure how long they'll last though, Mavis said reluctantly. If they have been fighting for this long, it will take just one or two hollows of high strength to clear them all out of there with ease. Most of the strong energy signatures though seem to be already in this area, clearing out some of the pockets of resistance or battling any strong mages or groups left. She frowned for a second before adding, going by the numbers I'm counting, you have a bit over 15,000 people still alive in there. That many. Jura clenched his fists tightly in frustration at the sight of them all before reluctantly lowering his eyes to the ground. I can't do anything to help them. Not yet, at least. The rough count that managed to get out safely is around 58,000. But only 33,000 of those men and women are actually able to fight. But to think so many died, almost 100,000 lost in almost no time at all. You're lucky you saved that many at all. I've seen the data on their initial assault at the start of the war, but this. The scale is entirely different. Far too many hollows, a massive amount more of Minos-class hollows at the Ajich's level, and I think even a load of Baragan's high command is here. Your own advantage this time around was that you didn't have a barrage of Ceros from the towering Jillians, but that doesn't make up for the strengths you've lost since then. The Celestial Spirit King. I heard what happened. Indeed. He changed the tide of battle with his mere presence, and without him here. Well, things couldn't have been good. You blame yourself for this, don't you? Jura nodded shamefully. I was one of the few people here capable of uniting the forces, and yet I had to abandon so many. It may have been right, but what if I had held off with the barrier for a bit longer? What if I had acted sooner to the hollow threat and realized the incoming danger? Was it even right of me to sacrifice so many people to protect those who made it out? Think like that and you'll drown in regrets, Ichigo muttered. This may be hypocritical of me to say, but don't blame yourself. There was nothing else you could have done, and if anything you made the best of a terrible situation. At least what you see as your worst mistake resulted in some good. Trust me, even the fact you saved this many people and gave a chance for the millions of civilians living the barrier is something to be glad about. I'm sure Ishine could have done a better job, however, Jura muttered himself. He was the general stationed here, and these were all good men and women under his command. My dad is probably beating himself up right now too, Ichigo muttered, causing Jura's head to snap towards him in shock. He came to help us out, and in return it meant he wasn't here when this happened. He was with you. Not on request. The idiot just showed up, but his help was appreciated nonetheless. We were trying to kill Wywak, but... well, that failed. End result though, he was with us when this happened. Please don't let him blame himself. Won't work, Ichigo muttered as he stared out at the sight before him. If I get that trait from someone, it's probably him. He'll no doubt believe he could have changed something if he was here, or at least believe he could have saved more lives as a result. Ichigo shook his head a few times to snap himself out of those thoughts before turning back to Jura. You did good just to save the people you did. If the hollows had spilled out from this point too, they would have had free reign over the entire interior. We would never be able to protect every city within or the people who can't fight against such overwhelming odds without taking huge losses. Pausing for a moment, Ichigo frowned as he scratched his chin, even going as far as to lean out a bit towards the edge and let his gaze drift from one place to the other. Is something wrong? No. Just counting. Mavis. Baragan's not here, nor is Starkey. And I don't think Ulquiorra is here either. But beyond that, I think this is all of them. I think. All of what? Jura asked, neither giving him a response as they spoke to one another. You think there might be a possibility Starkey is on our side then? If he's not, then it'll be one very convincing trap. But going by my own opinion on him, I think we could take the risk here. The major problem is Baragan. You've had a little over a few hours rest after fighting for your life against Wywak. Fighting Baragan in your state. I wouldn't recommend it. But will there be another chance like this? I don't know. We could try and lure him out anyway, but if we fight him on his own ground, then you don't need to worry about the surroundings too much. That's what I'm thinking. The matter left is Dash. Ichigo. Jura's voice snapped both of them back to the bald man still with them. Sheepishly rubbing the back of his head, Ichigo muttered out a quick apology. Sorry. Just something we're remembering. You mind sharing? Jura asked, more patiently this time. You sound like you have some kind of plan. It's... Ichigo paused again as he glanced to the side to look at the mass of hollows and humans fighting still. It's not something I can do here. Baragan is not here right now. That's what we believe, at least based on a warning we were given. We didn't know when this would happen, but the hollow who told us this gave us some cryptic words for when this happened. A turncoat in the hollows. Yeah. We weren't sure on what to make on it, whether or not we could trust him, but if there is even a shred of truth, Baragan will be alone with maybe 1 or 2 guards with him. His army is here, not there. So if I was to go after him now, you could fight him without worrying about any distractions. Ichigo nodded. Exactly. But the problem is... He sighed, unwilling to say what his actions would entail. But it didn't matter. Jura already understood. You would have to abandon this fight, Jura stated in realization. So that is why you are conflicted. Looking back at the chaos himself, Jura struggled himself to say what he needed to before finally speaking. Do it. What? I said do it. This threat is overwhelming dangerous for us. It could mean our end if nothing changes soon. But we haven't lost all hope yet. I believe we can still salvage this. If the hole is still being held, then there is a good chance that if we send help we can keep it sealed. Then there is only the matter of dealing with the hollows already in the barrier and destroying the hollow that initially created the hole. There's at least 30,000 hollows left in here, Mavis pointed out. And it looks like another 70,000 outside, if you can't block the hole in time, with over 2,000 Minos Grandes. A single hollow is stronger than a single human, so their soldier strength is already above ours on average. With how many men we have left here, you don't stand a chance under normal odds. Requests for help weren't just sent to you. We've had responses from every other battlefield and have teleporters preparing to bring mages in from all areas. The defeat of the last remnants of Ziref's forces has opened up a great opportunity for us, and Byakuya has even responded that he is preparing every mage at his disposal to bring to our aid. A single rune knight might not match up much to a hollow, but what about a mage? That is how we'll tip the tide. With magic. But none of us can beat Baragan, Jura added as he continued, turning away from the battlefield to face Ichigo. That is what we've been told at least. Baragan is regarded as threat equal to the likes of Ziref and Wywak, and having seen your power I can concede that I cannot match it. Which is why you cannot afford to miss this chance. If you can strike at the heart of the enemy while they are exposed and we hold them here, we just might be able to end this. Otherwise this war could drag on for far longer than any of us would like, and if so many had to die I would rather they died for a chance like this than for more to die needlessly as a result. Is that so? Ichigo tore his eyes away from the chaos before staring directly at Jura and searching for any weakness in that resolve of his or for any doubts. Are you sure? Positive. Go. Stop Baragan now and end this before that hollow can put any more of his plans into action. If he could get his army to penetrate the barrier today, he'll undoubtedly do it again. He has to be stopped now before he can cause more harm. All right, Ichigo finally replied with. But if I'm doing this, then I'll be going alone. Don't tell my friends when they get here. Have them help you here. Are you sure? Positive. You'll need all the help you can get here if you plan to retake the ground lost and save those left. Trust me, they'll be invaluable to you. I wouldn't fight alongside them if I didn't believe that they can handle the mess they'd be pulled into by my actions. Jura nodded. If you're sure. But what if they ask about you? Ichigo tugged at the cloak he was wearing. Suppresses my magical power. Tell me, can you even sense me here? No, and I'm standing right in front of you. This is why. They are familiar with this cloak. They actually have seen me use it plenty of times and know why I use it. It's to stop the enemy from sensing my location and planning accordingly, which generally means they try and use other means to draw me out, but that's beside the point. They won't sense me, but they won't expect to either, so simply tell them something believable. You know the situation best, so make up something that fits well with that. Alright then. Let's head back down and dash. No need. I'll leave that way. Gesturing at the hollows, Ichigo pointed towards the large hole in the center of the battlefield. I'll sneak right past them the best way I can. What is that? And never mind that, how do you plan to even get past them unnoticed? They'll attack you on sight. They will if I look human, Ichigo stated, holding up his arm for Jura to see before it began to change, a bone-white substance forming over the skin and changing its shape. Fingers became claws as the substance began to settle, the entire arm turned pure white with a far more hollow-like appearance than before. They won't attack their own kind if I don't make a move on them. Will that work? Jura asked him skeptically. I mean, it looks real and all, but will they really believe it? Ichigo shrugged. Probably. I'm about 60% sure they will. But opening another hole in the barrier will cause questions, and I don't have time to take the long route if I'm going there alone. Nozomi could get me there in an instant, but then she'd also ask to stay, and her legendary spell might be helpful here. But I should probably make this form more believable. Reaching within, Ichigo brought the hollow energy to the surface and began to shape it. The form was easy, the hollow side of Zanjutsu providing the image needed perfectly. Like a second layer of skin, the hollow form began to appear across his body under the cloak. Most of it beneath the cloak was unnecessary, its purpose in changing more to help focus the full image. What mattered what could be seen by chance? Arms, legs, but the most important area was the head. A bone-white mask formed across his head, but it didn't stop there, shaping round further until it was more like a helmet than a mask, two large bent horns at its sides. A single red line went down each eye hole while his hair lengthened down his back in response to the form he was picturing. He knew from just one look that Jura recognized this form. The shock was only visible on his face for a moment, as was the fear, before it was locked away from view. But he knew it was still there. And why wouldn't it be? Jura had fought him in this exact state before, only then he had been a true hollow, uncontrollable and lost to an endless hunger restrained by very little of his old self. Well? He asked, his voice coming out with that old double echo he remembered from the times he wore his mask. Look good. Absolutely, Jura managed to say after a few moments. They'll never be able to tell the difference. But the cloak might raise some issues. A hollow's intelligence is limited depending on its overall strength, Mavis stated as she leapt back up onto Ichigo's shoulder. Most should just ignore him by that alone. Any hollow with more human-like appearances or even human-like traits like wearing clothes is obviously one that is highly evolved. They'll likely even assume he's suppressing his power or it is too high for them to detect and won't bother looking further. The smart hollows are the issue, but they are also easy to detect on the battlefield, so we can avoid them. Frowning for a moment, Jura glanced back at the battlefield before shaking his head. Don't go out through the hole. It'll raise questions if you don't fight the mages down there, and that might blow your cover. Instead, head for the barrier's edge. You can still sense the lingering energy where that foul energy was. The magical barrier particles. It's at that edge, Ichigo said as he pointed in the correct direction. Why? I blocked off the damage at the top of the barrier there. I don't know if it has been broken yet, but the hole should at least be present if you clear away any earth still left. Get out that way and you should have no problems, I hope. The only danger. Jura simply gestured to what they could see outside the barrier, which was nothing at this height. Those are all zeros, by the way. So immediately bombardment if I go out that way. Only above a certain level. But it's why no hollows have gone that way, I would reckon, because it's safer to just clear out the tunnel route and charge in there. Hopefully that will mean you'll find little resistance that way if you're careful. Ichigo nodded. Alright, I'll give it a try. Thanks, Jura. Jura stopped himself, but it still made Ichigo stop, a step away from dropping off the edge of the barrier and down into the chaos below. What's wrong? Is something up? After a few moments, Jura simply shook his head. He wanted to ask more. Wanted to ask about the levy he had fought, or the man he assumed was Laxus. He wanted to ask why he had fought them or why they had that strange power. But he found himself hesitating all the same. Mentioning that he had seen Levi with Avatar, or at least someone that was far too similar to her to be a coincidence, was not something he could do. Not when it would only raise questions and confusion for Ichigo when he already had this much to focus on. So instead he settled for a few simple words. It's nothing. I'll ask when you return. He would have another chance. He knew he would, because he had no doubt Ichigo would return alive. And he had to believe he wouldn't die here today too if he wanted to keep hope alive. Stay safe. Safe. Ichigo chuckled. If what I'm doing is safe, I really question your sanity. Taking a step off, Ichigo flung himself down to the ground, using his magic periodically to slow his fall until he hit the ground and dashed off into the distance with Sonito. Jura kept watch for a few more moments before backing away and closing up the earth barrier behind him. Good luck, he muttered before beginning his own process of lowering himself to the ground. We're all going to need it. Protector of the fairies. Something's wrong, Kisuke said as he paced across the room. Nozomi should have returned by now. Where is she? I'm not sure, Hibiki said, engrossing himself in the screens before him. I've widened my scans, but it'll take time to collect the data. This isn't like her to just disappear like this. Not without some kind of warning. Unless she was ordered to, Hades pointed out in amusement, enjoying the work he was doing of looking through the information they had received. Oh, would you look at that? So that sand beast does exist. I wonder if I can get some samples from it afterwards. What on earth are you talking about? That sand hollow, remember? Honestly, I was sure you had been keeping up to date. Not that. The part about her being ordered. Hades sighed, pushing the small screen in front of him away and letting it get dismissed by Hibiki. This should be obvious, shouldn't it? There are different hierarchies in this group, despite how some might pretend otherwise. Ichigo is our leader, for example, and will typically do what he desires and others will follow. But then you also hold a sizable power here too, not in strength but in the information you can gather and your control over the genesis. That is why others will typically defer to you in battle and will sometimes even override any orders they were previously given with your own, assuming you have the latest information on the battlefield. All except two of them. Mistogin and Nozomi. Congratulations. You got it in one guess. I'm imp. Enough, Hades, Hibiki snarled out in anger. Your point. The man sighed, rubbing his brow in annoyance before gesturing out at him. You're a smart individual. You should know that if Mistogin or Nozomi were given a specific order by Ichigo that they would follow to it to the letter, regardless of what you say. So if she's not back here by now, it's not that far off to assume that perhaps Ichigo gave her orders that she put as a higher priority than your own. As fun as such thoughts are, I doubt that's the case, Kisuke stated as he came to a stop. We've only heard reports of the state of the battlefield, but Ichigo would be seeing it right now. There is no way he would go against us bringing in reinforcements. And honestly he probably wants us there to ensure he can leave. The message from the hollow, Hibiki muttered in realization. Of course. If he thinks the situation matches the message sent to him, he might very well take the risk. But if it's a trap? Oh. Bringing his hands to his face, Hibiki let out a groan before leaning back into his seat and letting the archive screens vanish from sight. We're idiots. We were so focused on the possibility that it could be a trap that we never considered what Ichigo would do as a result. Kisuk nodded. He's going in alone. When there is such a big threat present, we should have remembered what his default plan would become. The opportunity to strike at Baragan is too good to pass up, and so Ichigo would obviously decide to go alone if he can't determine whether it's a trap or not. That also leaves us to cover the northern battlefield and rid himself of any regrets of having to abandon the fight there. He's counting on us to halt the assault there while he deals with the issue permanently. So then where is the girl? Hades muttered, actually looking curious for once. Ichigo would have ordered her back here to bring us over, so if she's not here. Interesting. Is she acting against his own orders and fulfilling her own agenda? I didn't think she had it in her. No, there's got to be something else, Hibiki shot back. She wouldn't be able to face Ichigo if she didn't bring us there like he would want. Something else has to be up. But what? No one answered him. Here they were, the smartest of their entire group, and were unable to work out what had happened or the actions of a single girl they all knew. Let us assume that for now she is unaccounted for, Kisuk final said, crossing his arms in thought as he began to run through different scenarios in his head. If we can't get to the front lines, we are useless here. Aid will come to the north, but considering the numbers being reported, we will still take heavy losses. The Genesis's firepower would have been a great help too, but, with it grounded like this, we're in a bind. Not necessarily, Hibiki muttered, rubbing his chin for a moment before bringing up a new screen to look at. If we were to, maybe do this and... He slowly nodded, satisfied with what he saw but not quite happy about it. I have an idea. It's not brilliant, and it's something I'm going to hate doing, but it might work. But first we need a way to get the ship and all of us to the enemy. What about Mest? Hades asked. He's a teleporter. Long range isn't his speciality dash. I can do it. Hibiki's eyes snapped towards the doorway, Mest standing there with his scythe slung over his shoulders. Sorry to bother you all, but I'd thought you'd want to know we've almost got everyone ready to fight again. Wendy and Kelia have been helping take Guildarts down to Fairy Tail behind the barrier, and I told them to stay with them and be teleported that way. As healers they can do a lot more good behind the battlefield today than at the front of it. Gray's already gone down there too with Urza and are taking Levi and Yuzo to make sure they are safely out of the way. Karen wanted to follow but agreed that she probably wouldn't be able to leave her sister's side if she did. Good. That'll actually make our job easier then, Hibiki replied back as he recomposed himself. You said you can do it? You understand how far we need you to teleport us, all right? And not just us, but the ship too. Mest nodded. After the incident with the Celestial Spirit King. He paused for a moment, clenching his fists in frustration before doing his best to shake those thoughts away. Well, I remember how helpless I felt. Nozomi could have gotten Ichigo there immediately, which was why she was targeted dash. Targeted. Mest paused in his explanation, turning towards Kisuk with everyone else. I'm sorry. Targeted. Nozomi was targeted then, that was what you said, correct? Mest slowly nodded, unsure of where Kisuk was going with this. Yes. By some demons if I remember correctly. One of the dash. 4 kings, I know. The Mist King in fact. Unless the reports are outdated, I'm pretty sure that is the one named demon unaccounted for. Unless something new came in Hibiki. Searching now, Hibiki shot back, his eyes rapidly scanning the screens he had pulled up around him. Mentions of Mardgear here but, nothing of the last king. He hasn't been sighted in a while now in fact. Isn't it odd that Nozomi vanishes at a moment she is so desperately needed? Kisuk asked. And at a time where she is probably going to be needed heavily by Ichigo too. If it's a demon we're dealing with, we know how they feel about Ziref. And we've seen the intentions Ziref has for Ichigo. Having him come back to a battlefield and find none of the help he had wanted there present after abandoning the area to go after Baragan. I can't even imagine what that would do to him mentally. Nozomi's missing? Mest asked. She's not back. No, which is why you're going to be very important here. Now, what were you saying about your solution? How can you get us all to the battlefield? Trying to push the worry out of his mind, Mest did his best to return his focus to his explanation. Well, I was saying how useless I felt when Nozomi was taken. When it comes to short-range teleportation, I pride myself in my ability. But beyond a certain distance I simply can't accurately teleport. My magic isn't like Nozomi's that lets her traverse such distances through her own personal dimension. I have to still travel through the world itself to reach my goal. But that doesn't mean I can't do long-range teleportation. If I have time to prepare. Which I assume you have had. Mest nodded. I went out with different groups of rune knights, one set at each barrier, during a normal push and prepared rune markings. It's very time-consuming work and it could be easily destroyed if found. I went out multiple times in secret to try and set up as many as possible, and I can still sense a link with about 2 markings. One is a few miles away from here while the other is near the hollow side. It's a miracle that one is still standing. I made it about 3 days ago, so I can only assume that was when Baragan must have started preparing for this full assault rather than wasting time on pointless attacks. And this marking is sufficient enough to bring this entire ship there with us. Mest shrugged. Honestly? Maybe. That's the best answer can give. Teleporting that kind of distance is going to be exhausting either way, and I can only do one trip with how much magic it'll consume. I've never taken anything this large with short-range teleportation, so I don't even know how it will fare when teleported this far. But if we don't have the option of Nozomi's portals, this is the only option left. Alright. Go ahead and make any preparations you need. Just let us know when you're ready and we'll prepare things on our end. Getting a nod in return, Kisuk turned back to Hibiki as Mest made to leave. So what's your plan, Hibiki? We have the issue of transport out of the way. How do you plan to even the odds for us? Hibiki scratched the back of his head awkwardly as he let out a weak laugh. I'd figure we'd blow up the Genesis in the middle of them all. Protector of the Fairies. Shoving what little items he had been able to gather quickly into a backpack, Shinji slung it over his back, tightening the cloak wrapped around his body that kept his magical power hidden from view. With that done, he finally brought his sword up and tied it to his waist for the time being, doing a final check for anything he might need. Going somewhere? His hand dropped down to his sword immediately before he stopped himself from drawing it, his nerves slowly settling down. You look like you're in a hurry. Taoshiro, Shinji said in greet, turning round to face the other Shinigami, the white-haired man's hands behind his back with his sword slung across there like always. What are you doing here? You should be resting. And you should be getting ready to fight, Taoshiro pointed out. Not to leave. What's happening? Just a little issue that came up, Shinji said as he shoved on a smile. Go on and rest for a bit longer. You'll dash. What's happened with Ichigo? Shinji's smile dropped, Taoshiro taking as his sign to continue pushing. I figured it was about him. You're rushing too much for it to not be related to him. The other option might have been me, and I'm standing here so we can cross that off the list. So I'll ask again. What's happening with Ichigo? Shinji sighed, slowly letting his hand fall away from his Zanpakuto. I overheard some stuff when I went up to check on Kisuk and the others. Remember Baragan's message? They think Ichigo has gone after Baragan alone since he can't work out if it's a trap or not. And you're going after him. It wasn't a question, and both of them knew it. Ichigo's strong but even he needs help sometimes, Shinji stated calmly. I'm not as strong as him but I'll still fight by his side and support him all the same. My Zanpakuto lets me do that, and with my by his side I'm sure he can't lose. Besides, I'm not much of a fan of letting family die for my sake. It already happened once before, and I don't want to watch it occur again if I can do anything to stop it. I suppose I can't say anything to stop you. Shinji shook his head. Nope. Sorry kid, but I'm going after him. You going to try and stop me? Toshiro shook his head before bringing his hands out from behind his back, revealing another of the cloaks that Shinji was wearing. It only took a moment for it to click for Shinji, and when it did he let out a wide smirk. You already knew. I saw you rush past and saw you start searching for stuff. I already had most of what I needed to fight ready, so I quickly went to get my own cloak too. If you don't mind me joining you. You sure, kid? It'll be dangerous. Sure you don't want to be with your girlfriend and fight by her side? Toshiro shook his head. We can't let Ichigo fight alone. Besides, it feels right for us go with him to settle this. Who better to assault the fortress of hollows than those that hunt them? Well said, Shinji said before slapping a hand down on Toshiro's back as he passed him. Let's go, kid. We'll need to be quick if we want to get out of her unnoticed and catch up with him. I'm not a kid, you know, Toshiro pointed out as he increased his pace to keep up with his friend. So? You have a plan to get us there? It's a long trip to make and I'm not sure there are many teleporters capable of getting us there before Ichigo does. Oh, I've got that sorted, Shinji replied, his usual smirk back in place. Been working on it for a while. It's never worked before, but then I guess I never had the right trigger for the instinct required to use it. Let's just get away from here first and then we can go help Ichigo before anyone else tries to tag along. So you probably don't want me hearing that too, said Miss Doggin as they turned the corner to find him standing there. Room for one more? Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.